Following the release and positive reception of Combat Evolved, Bungie was ready to begin right away on a sequel. Many members of the team were excited at the opportunity to bring many ideas cut from Combat Evolved onto people's consoles. However, yet again as with Combat Evolved, Microsoft's financial interests dictated a tight deadline. With the expected launch of the 360 in 2005, from the perspective of Microsoft, Halo 2 could come out no later than 2004. During these early concept stages, decisions would be made and ideas brought forward that would shape all subsequent Halo titles. Dual wielding would be introduced. We get a lot more information on the Covenant's Capital High Charity, how we'd get a lot more information on the Covenant in general. Despite some dissenting voices, the team ultimately decided Halo 2 would take place in more shoes than just the Chiefs, with the player taking control of who, at the time, was called the Dervish, and later renamed to the Arbiter, in order to facilitate this deeper look into the Covenant. By the time E3 2003 rolled around, the team had spent a significant amount of work trying to see this version of Halo 2 through on their new stencil engine. Sadly, the new Xbox's hardware was just not enough to cut it, and as a result, their E3 demo had to be played rather precisely so as not to break the game in front of a live audience. While the demo certainly made the massive hype for Halo 2 even more immense, it was clear to the team that drastic changes had to be made. That started with the engine, of course. And with the release date unwavering and having to throw out an entire engine and build so late, the team was in a dilemma, and it became clear the team would have to make the painful choice of drastically pulling back on many of their ambitions for Halo 2. Weapons were cut, game modes were cut, but the aspect hit hardest by the cuts by far was the campaign. The entire third act would be cut, the results of this leading to the permanent change of a lot of what the third act would even contain. The Ark, which was once on Earth, would later become its own installation outside of the Milky Way galaxy. The Arbiter, who was once written to have the final ending of the game discovering secrets about the Foreigners as the Ark collapsed and all this stuff, became no longer playable, and needless to say, never got his own missions on Earth in the sequel. Rather than spawn a spontaneous romance at the end with Chief, oddly enough, weird subplot there, we'll get into that later, Miranda Keyes would end up being quite literally shot in the back instead. So, needless to say, by cutting the third act from Halo 2's resolution, the story we got ended up with a Halo 3 that only vaguely resembles the original resolution for Halo 2's first two arcs and how the third arc was going to resolve itself. However, despite the vast cuts and development crunch like no other, Bungie would manage to get Halo 2 out on time. So let's see what we got when it shipped. The box art is straight from one of the trailers. Here we got Master Chief in his set of new armor, dual-wielding SMGs, a new weapon introduced in this game, of course, on top of a building with new Mombasa in the background. Just awesome. And on the back, we obviously have several nice screenshots of the game. At the bottom left, we've got Chief dual-wielding a plasma rifle and an SMG firing into an elite on Cairo Station with a pair of grunts in the back. And then the text underneath that reads, quote-unquote, "Fight to save the planet in vehicles, on foot, and with the help of the last Marines on Earth," end quote. Unfortunately, the Marines admittedly still aren't too helpful outside of a turret, but that's a nice sentiment. The bottom middle has two blue Spartans facing off against three red ones on burial mounds. One blue Spartan is firing his battle rifle at a retreating red Spartan who's having his shields lit up, while the other blue Spartan has jumped in the air and is firing a rocket at a warthog with one of the other two red Spartans driving and the other on the gunner spot. The text for this one says, quote, "Revel in a massively enhanced multiplayer game and take the battle to Xbox Live," end quote. Which is a great selling point. If I recall correctly, Combat Evolved didn't have Xbox Live, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, the last of the three bottom picks is a first-person perspective of a red Spartan wielding an energy sword looking at two blue elites also wielding energy swords on what looks like the rocks of coagulation. In the right side of the background, there's an explosion from what's possibly a fuel rod or a Banshee bomb. And to the right side in the background, there's a Scorpion. It states, quote, "With Xbox Live, join clans, customize armor, communicate with friends, and enjoy a social experience like no other," end quote. Yeah, I'll say. Above those three, there's yet another screenshot, this one of Chief hijacking a ghost from an elite on Outskirts, and it's got two boxes of texts hanging around it. First in the bottom right says, quote, "New weapons, new abilities, and new environments change the Halo universe in unexpected and exhilarating ways," end quote. While the other, to the left of the screenshot, reads, quote, "The destruction of Halo slowed the Covenant, but it did not stop them. Fueled by faith, fury, and vengeance, They've swept aside all of our defenses and gained a foothold on the most precious prize of all, Earth. With the human military scattered and crushed, the fate of the planet lies in the hands of one man, Spartan 117, the Master Chief. But resourceful and tenacious as he is, the Master Chief will have to rely on new weapons, unexpected allies, and a secret so incredible it will change the galaxy forever. End quote. Lastly, at the top, we've got a pic of Chief on outskirts wielding a sniper with two ODSTs. One of them's using an SMG and the other BR right next to him, while behind him is a Marine on a Warthog gun, and above all of them are two Pelicans flying past with one sentence underneath simply reading, quote, "Earth will never be the same," end quote. Unfortunately, I think the back really doubled down on people's inaccurate expectations from E3 as to what Halo 2 is even about. It doubles on this, or sort of doubles down on this emphasis that so much is going to take place on Earth by speaking about it in multiple quotes and having more than half of the screenshots be on the 3 missions that are on it or in orbit above Earth, when in reality, only 3 of the 13 missions are spent there, so Earth does not actually make up that much of the campaign as a whole. So it's not like terrible, but slightly misleading. And one last thing before we boot up the game is the disc art, and I must say, it always disappoints me when it's literally the same thing as the box cover. But I'm being picky at this point, so let's start getting into the game itself. Well, that's a way to get me hyped to play. A sick guitar followed by this absolutely beautiful main menu music. Everything is varying shades of blue as the camera moves around this awesome model of the Covenant ship over New Mombasa. And here's what the alpha menu looked like. Still great, but nowhere near as perfect as what we got in the final release in my opinion. While we're at it, let's go over what Halo 2 brought to customization. You can modify both primary and secondary colors. You can also choose from one of many awesome emblems and backgrounds, being able to choose the color of each, and of course you could either be an Elite or a Spartan. While compared to the later Halo games, it wasn't nearly as expansive. It really just sort of laid down the groundwork for those later games that could be built off of. Additionally, I think Halo 2 is a good benchmark for the minimum amount of customization acceptable in a Halo title on release. And yes, this is me saying that being unable to be an Elite since Reach and as of Infinite, still not being able to even freely choose your colors in many cases, are just both awful changes by the new studio, formerly 343, now Halo Studios. And I'd rather, quite frankly, have Halo 2's customization system in Infinite than Infinite's own system in Infinite, if you know what I'm saying. Next, we'll be going over every multiplayer map, including the weapons, vehicles, and a few notes from each, just very briefly, in alphabetical order, of course, starting with Ascension, and that's obviously one of the base game maps with a recommended player count of 2 to 12. It's located on a relay station atop a skyscraping stone pillar on Delta Halo, and the text for it and the description is, "This relay station is part of a network that has kept Delta Halo functioning smoothly for untold centuries," end quote. You'll find 5 frags, 3 plasmas, 1 plasma pistol, 2 needlers, 2 battle rifles, 2 SMGs, 1 magnum, 2 snipers, 1 rocket, 1 shotgun, and a single Banshee to fight on in here. It's well known for being great for super bounces as well, and even has a few ways to get out of the map entirely, apparently. Backwash is part of the Maptacular map pack and is recommended for 2 to 10 players in a flood-infected swamp on Delta Halo. And the previous sentence for this one is, "There are strong indications that beneath the shroud of mist drowning this swamp on Delta Halo lies a powerful intelligence," end quote. Despite having a lower max player count recommended, this map actually has even more weapon variety than Ascension, with 3 frags, 3 plasmas, 2 plasma pistols, a battle rifle, 4 SMGs, 2 magnums, 2 shotguns, a carbine, 4 battle rifles, 2 sentinel beams, a brute shot, active camo, and an energy sword. And this map has a ton of interesting history and Easter eggs. While I'm not going to spoil most of these, there are 2 things I'd like to take note of. Firstly, Penitent Tangent, who is floating around this map, sounds different than their campaign counterpart. And it turns out it's because originally it was going to be Guilty Spark floating around here. They ultimately switched monitors because Spark's blue light apparently looked too much like a plasma grenade in the fog. And since they hadn't recorded any lines for Tangent's voice actor for this map. The second thing of note is they modified Spark's sound files they had on hand to try and make it sound closer to Penitent Tangent. Beaver Creek is a base game level recommended for only 2 to 8 players in a tiny canyon on Delta Halo. Its summary is, these forgotten structures were once the site of many bitter battles but have since been reclaimed by nature, end quote. There are no more than 2 of any weapon on this map, with the available weapons being frags, plasmas, plasma pistols, needlers, battle rifles, SMGs, magnums, snipers, plasma rifles, as well as an overshield, a rocket, and a shotgun. The only Easter egg that I have of note here, or any extra, though I admit I didn't even know this before doing research for this video, but apparently if you push rocks down from the sniper tower, there's a red versus blue reference on the wall quoted. Cool. Burial Mounds is another base game map, ideally for 4 to 16 players on the Moon basis, the Moon by Alpha Halo. Fun fact about Basis, originally the Heretic levels in the campaign were supposed to take place here, but in a snowy environment, and ultimately, as you can see, they changed it into a desert one instead and gave it a multiplayer map make instead. Its weapon sandbox includes 4 frags, 2 plasmas, 2 plasma pistols, 2 needlers, 3 battle rifles, a rocket, a sniper, a carbine, an energy sword, a beam rifle, and 3 plasma rifles. In addition, there's also a pair of vehicles with a Warthog and a Ghost on each side. Apparently, it's possible to get out of this map too, but the only way I could find it requires more than 2 players. It's one of only a handful of places we'll cover that were playable in the alpha build. Check out Vengeful Vadam's video, linked hopefully in the playlist affiliated with this video if you want to get all the details and notable changes, but I'll quickly point out that the lack of cover in general in the alpha build versus the final release is a very significant difference, adding several rocks across the place to hide behind, actually. Coagulation is another base game map for 4 to 16 players recommended in a large valley on Delta Halo. On here you'll find 4 frags, 2 plasmas, a pair of plasma pistols, a needler, 4 battle rifles, 4 magnums, 2 snipers, a rocket, a pair of shotguns, 4 plasma rifles, a pair of brute shots, as well as 2 active camos and overshields. Additionally, to get around this area, the devs gave us 2 Warthogs, 2 Ghosts, and 2 Banshees, evenly split between each base. This is also the level where the only one way to break out requires you to change the game settings to get yourself a Spectre, and you've also got a pair of Easter eggs by the tunnel and a trio of rocks. Colossus is yet another base game map in a row, with the recommended player count in this one being 4 to 14, located amongst the floating gas mines of Threshold, the gas giant that Alpha Halo was orbiting. Amongst here, we'll find scattered across the area 4 frags, 4 plasmas, 2 plasma pistols, 4 needlers, 4 battle rifles, 4 magnums, 3 shotguns, 4 plasma rifles, a beam rifle, as well as one of each of the power-ups, those being the overshield and active camo, of course. Apparently there's a fun glitch you can do where if you repeatedly jump in front of the overshield, you can float in the air, but I think that may be exclusive to the original hardware because I couldn't replicate this on MCC, sadly, myself. Containment is part of the bonus map pack for recommended 6 to 16 player count located in a chilly valley on Delta Halo. And fitting the higher ideal player count, we have big numbers of weapons across the place, with 6 frags, 8 plasmas, 2 plasma pistols, 2 needlers, 8 battle rifles, 2 magnums, a pair of snipers, a pair of rockets, a pair of shotguns, 4 carbines, 6 plasma rifles, a pair of brute shots, a pair of active camos, an overshield, as well as 2 Gauss Warthogs and 2 Banshees, split evenly between each base. And then lastly, of course, at the back of each base, we can, of course, find the beloved marathon symbol, ever so common in the Halo games, especially the Bungie era ones. Desolation is part of the Blastacular map pack and is intended for 2 to 8 players, being located in an isolated Forerunner arena on Delta Halo. And in this arena, we're given 6 frags, 4 plasmas, a pair of needlers and battle rifles and SMGs, as well as 4 magnums, a rocket, 2 shotguns, 4 plasma rifles, and a pair of sentinel beams and brute shots. Oh, and also a sword and 2 overshields. This is actually the last time we'll see the sentinel beam in this episode, as this and the previously covered Backwash are the only 2 maps that spawn it regularly, apparently. District is a big team battle map from the Halo 2 Vista port with a suggested player count of 8 to 16 and is the first Earth map we'll be covering today, located in Old Mombasa, as pretty much all the Earth maps in this multiplayer are. There are some exceptions, but most of them are. And in this map, you'll have every available weapon in the multiplayer, giving us 14 frags, 8 plasmas, a pair of plasma pistols, 3 needlers, 4 battle rifles, 8 SMGs, 2 magnums, 2 snipers, a rocket, 3 shotguns, 2 carbines, 3 plasma rifles, a brute shot, an energy sword, a beam rifle, pardon me, an overshield, and an active camo. We also get to utilize 4 warthogs and a whopping 8 ghosts. This makes District one of only 2 levels in the multiplayer that has every single weapon available in normal gameplay. Elongation is part of the Maptacular map pack and is meant for 2 to 6 players. Being aboard the UNSC freighter Onan and orbiting above Earth, on this map every weapon available comes in the count of 2. SMGs, battle rifles, magnums, shotguns, plasma pistols, plasma rifles, brute shots, frags, and plasmas. The conveyor belt is definitely the best part of this map and leads to a few interesting effects. Firstly, weapons constantly bounce while on the conveyor belt. However, oddly enough, plasma grenades just stand still like a stone with no rolling or bouncing. Lastly, if you stand still and let the conveyor belt move you, the enemy won't be able to see your movement on their motion trackers, which is a helpful little tip if you're trying to be sneaky on this map. Foundation is a base game map for 2 to 8 players, being part of a decommissioned area of Chicago's Industrial Zone 08. This homage to a marathon map gives us 4 SMGs, 2 battle rifles, 4 magnums, 2 shotguns, a pair of rockets, an energy sword, 4 needlers, 5 frags, and 3 plasmas. This map has a method to break out, actually, that I've done before personally. If you do what's called a butterfly jump through the ceiling in vent room number 1 here, you'll be able to get free. And apparently room number 3 has some banshees in the windows that I don't even recall noticing. And finally, apparently there's a 7-step trick to get into the secret 5th room. Hopefully I remember to link what Halo fandom says to do in the description, and if not, feel free to look that up on your own. It was a lot, but it was interesting. Gemini is part of the Maptacular map pack with the suggested number of players ranging only from 2 to 6. As you can tell, it's a part of High Charity, more specifically the Gardens of Reverent Contemplation. Gemini is one of my favorite map sandboxes, very untraditional, giving us 2 plasma pistols, 4 plasma rifles, 1 beam rifle, 2 brute shots, 2 carbines, an energy sword, 2 needlers, 6 plasmas, and an overshield. Somewhat surprisingly, over the 68 multiplayer levels of the original trilogy, this would literally be the only one giving us a view of the Forerunner Dreadnought, a somewhat iconic ship in the game. Headlong is a base game map intended for games with 6 to 16 players, and unlike District, this is in New Mombasa, Section 14 to be specific. This is actually the only map in the base game that gives us at least one of every weapon, with the only other Halo 2 map being one of the ones that we covered earlier. Of course, District from Halo 2 Vista port. I counted 3 SMGs, 3 battle rifles, 2 magnums, a sniper, 2 shotguns, 2 rockets, 3 plasma pistols, 4 plasma rifles, a beam rifle, a brute shot, 2 carbines, an energy sword, 6 needlers, 1 overshield, 1 active camo, 7 frags, and 5 plasmas. On top of the vast array of weapons and equipment, we're also lucky enough to get a warthog, a banshee, 2 ghosts, and a gauss warthog. Unfortunately, much like the Sentinel Beam, the Gauss Warthog only spawns on 2 levels during the normal settings. However, having one of the 2 being on a level with every weapon in the game makes up for that a bit, needless to say. While I can never get it right myself, it's somewhat common knowledge that utilizing the Banshee on here can also help you break out of the map on this one. Ivory Tower is another base game map in New Mombasa, this one being meant for 2 to 12 players and is part of a park high up in the skyscrapers of the city. As far as weaponry in this serene park, we've got a pair of SMGs, a battle rifle, a pair of magnums, 1 sniper, a shotgun, a rocket, 3 plasma pistols, 3 plasma rifles, an energy sword, 2 needlers, 4 frags, 4 plasmas, and an overshield. The name actually has several layers to the meaning of it, as ivory tower is a common literary metaphor for someone disconnected from reality, which is fitting of Lance O'Donnell's description in, each map's lore description. And additionally, the Ivory Towers was the name of Marty O'Donnell's sound studio at one time, and Lance was obviously Marty's gamer tag on Xbox Live at one time as well. So, yeah, that's sort of all the connections with that name. Lockout is another small base game map with an ideal player count ranging from 2 to 6 and is located somewhere on Delta Halo. On this level, we're gifted an SMG, a pair of battle rifles, 3 magnums, 1 sniper, 1 shotgun, a plasma pistol, a pair of plasma rifles, an energy sword, 2 needlers, 2 frags, and 3 plasmas. Fun fact about the green hallway area is actually it's inspired by a marathon multiplayer map, much like all of Foundation's layout, as we talked about earlier. This is the second level that has an alpha build, with the cliff notes on changes being the alpha grav lift was way too strong, it could kill you, several slight visual changes, and immortal fusion coils in the alpha. Midship is another 2-day player base game map, this one being aboard the Pious Inquisitor as it floats in space. The weapon sandbox here contains 2 battle rifles, 1 shotgun, 1 plasma pistol, a pair of plasma rifles, a carbine, an energy sword, 4 needlers, a frag, and 3 plasmas. Surprisingly, you can break out of this level too, but it requires following a guide and having an assistant. Also of note is the name, as originally during development, this heavy warship of the Covenant was Begotten Angel. But Pious Inquisitor and Begotten Angel, either or. Both are just cool-ass names, so good on the developers and the writers. Relic is part of the Maptacular map pack with an ideal count of 6 to 16 players, and is located on an isolated island in the middle of the sea on Delta Halo. On this island, we'll find 4 SMGs, 4 battle rifles, a pair of magnums, a rocket, a shotgun, 2 plasma pistols, 4 plasma rifles, 2 carbines, an energy sword, 5 needlers, 5 frag grenades, and 5 plasma grenades. We also finally get some vehicles again with 1 regular Warthog and 1 Ghost to zoom around in. While most people's favorite fun act might be the various ways to get on top of the tower in the middle, personally I think having the only Albatross in all of Halo 2's multiplayer is just the far more interesting thing of note on this map. Sanctuary is part of the Killtacular map pack and has a recommended player count of 2 to 10. Across its layout you'll find a pair of battle rifles, a pair of magnums, a pair of snipers, a shotgun, 2 plasma pistols, 4 plasma rifles, a pair of carbines, an energy sword, 2 needlers, 4 frags, and 4 plasmas. There are multiple Easter egg texts and drawings along the pillars and walls, and of course we've got more marathon symbols on the broken pillars all over the place here. Terminal is another gem from the Maptacular map pack, with the stated recommended player count being 6 to 16, and brings us back to New Mombasa on Earth and this deadly train station. As far as weaponry is concerned here, there's 2 SMGs, 5 battle rifles, a pair of magnums, a pair of snipers, a pair of shotguns, a rocket launcher, 2 plasma pistols, 4 plasma rifles, 2 carbines, an energy sword, 7 frags, 8 plasmas, and an overshield. You also get 2 ghosts, a warthog, and a wraith, interestingly enough, in addition to all of that. Tombstone is part of the Blastacular map pack with a wide range of recommended players from 4 to 16. And much like most of the Earth map locations, Tombstone is also part of Mombasa. As far as goodies to grab, we've got 4 SMGs, 2 magnums, 3 battle rifles, a sniper, a rocket, 2 shotguns, 5 plasma rifles, 2 brute shots, an energy sword, 3 needlers, 8 frags, 4 plasmas, and 2 overshields. Interestingly enough, this is the only map that has the gaming's, or at least the territory game mode's maximum number of territories on it, that being 7 in total, which is just a sort of odd quirk. Turf is part of the Killtacular map pack and is ideal for 2 to 10 players. Yet again, it brings us to Old Mombasa. Across the level, your weapons, as far as options are concerned, include 3 SMGs, 1 magnum, 3 battle rifles, a sniper, a shotgun, 2 plasma pistols, 4 plasma rifles, 2 brute shots, 5 frags, 5 plasmas, and you even get a warthog. We've got several other fun stuff to check out too, which includes the Rooster Teeth vending machines and even more glorious golden warthog ads, sort of like in Headlong. Uplift is one of the Halo 2 Vistaport maps intended for 6 to 16 players and is somewhat similar to Relic in that it's also on an island in Delta Halo. This level has 5 SMGs, 2 Magnums, 3 battle rifles, a sniper, a rocket, 2 shotguns, 2 plasma pistols, 7 plasma rifles, a brute shot, 3 carbines, an energy sword, a needler, 5 frags, 9 plasmas, 2 overshields, and 1 active camo. While for vehicles, we also get a Warthog and 3 ghosts. The only interesting thing to add to this level is that walking in the red beam and dying can actually unlock 2 different achievements for you, oddly enough. Warlock is part of the bonus map pack with suggested player counts ranging from 2 to 8. This is yet another Forerunner arena on Delta Halo, and sandbox-wise, it includes a Magnum, 4 battle rifles, 4 shotguns, 4 plasma rifles, 4 needlers, 5 plasmas, and an active camo. This is yet another level I love to get out of the map, and you can just simply use the grenades to make your way up the walls to get out here. Second to last is Waterworks, one of the original maps from the game, the base game, and my favorite map from Halo 2, actually. It has an ideal count of 6 to 16 for player total, and is located in a massive underground cavern somewhere unspecified on Earth. You can find 4 SMGs, 4 Magnums, 6 battle rifles, 2 snipers, 2 rockets, a pair of shotguns, 4 plasma pistols, 2 plasma rifles, a brute shot, 2 carbines, an energy sword, 4 needlers, 4 frags, and 5 plasmas. In addition, there's a lot of vehicles with a pair of Wraiths, Banshees, Ghosts, and regular Warthogs split evenly between each base. And while it's well known you can shoot down the stalactites and kill players with it, another interesting thing is to see if you can look up in the skybox. And while we don't know where on Earth this is exactly, we know it is Earth because if you look up, you can see our moon in the sky. This is actually one of the last 3 maps that had an alpha build available to us. And the most notable changes include different rock architecture around the central bases, no holes in the wall dropping down to the first floor of your base, and much smaller holes in the caves of the roof, with the only skybox stuff being sort of plain white rather than any interesting details like I just talked about. And the final map in Halo 2 in alphabetical order is Zanzibar. It's another base game map with a recommended player count of 2 to 16, and is part of Wind Power Station 7 on the island of Zanzibar. Its sandbox includes 5 battle rifles, 2 snipers, 1 rocket, a pair of shotguns, 6 plasma rifles, an energy sword, 2 needlers, 5 frags, 6 plasmas, and an active camo. And you can also drive around in the pair of Ghosts and Warthogs, and it has 2 fun Easter eggs, including a message on the panel that you can unlock when you unlock the door, and a special beach sign that would have different images for several different special days back in the OG Xbox Live days. Quickly, before we move on to the next segment of the video, let's touch on the multiplayer UI. Menu-wise, I don't have much more to add that I didn't already say when talking about the main menu. However, once in-game, the HUD itself in-game is pretty neat. We have our grenades on the top left, weapons and ammo on the top right, and our shields and motion tracker, on the bottom left, and a scoreboard on the bottom right with the crosshair in the bottom middle of the screen, as is pretty traditional for the Halo series. Although later it would end up being more centered, but that's a whole other rabbit hole. And it's, in my opinion, a sort of nice, smooth evolution of what Halo Combat Evolved used. Although, admittedly, when I found out what the alpha build's HUD looks like, I think I prefer that a little bit more. Lastly, let's go over some of the game modes available on all these levels. Firstly, Slayer, Oddball, CTF, and King of the Hill, a bunch of classics, all returned straight from Combat Evolved. And there's also a lot of further customization that can be based on certain variables that the host can choose, such as like the sword subvariant of Slayer giving everybody energy swords when spawning, and stuff like this, which obviously wasn't available in CE. And we'd also get 3 brand new modes that have become staples for the franchise, which include Juggernaut, Territories, and Assault. And as well as mentioned in the first episode, Halo 2 would be the first in the series to bring multiplayer to Xbox Live, which the impact of which certainly can't be overstated. Earlier concepts of Halo 2 have some interesting additions here as well when it comes to game modes. Firstly, the Juggernaut game type was going to be a lot more literal originally. The Juggernaut would literally transform into the cut flood enemy type of the same name, and the rest of the players would have to team up to take them down. However, this was cut fairly early on, likely just due to how much of a headache it caused for map design and coding, which Bungie just simply didn't have the time to address given the crunch. In addition, there were also two entirely cut modes. Headhunter, which would eventually be implemented in Halo Reach using basically the same icon as Halo 2's cut version, and worked pretty much the same exact way mechanically as we got in the final product of Reach. And the other was Warfare, which was sort of similar to Invasion, which we also got in Halo Reach with humans versus elites. But this version, each player only had one life per round, which would have been a very interesting touch. And win. Getting right into the mission. Starting off, you're leaving the same area you walked to earlier. Fun fact. Interesting weapon layout note here. If you look at the weapon recs, there's only going to be new weapons to the series. As in, like, starting from Combat Evolved going forward, you're only going to have new weapons introduced in Halo 2, aka the BR and SMG in this case. So clearly the devs wanted the players to mess around with the sandbox right away. Take note of that, because I think that's a great decision. Good idea. Heading into the first room, we get a beautiful view out the window of us orbiting over the Earth with other stations in the distance. These sort of computer thingies you can use for cover, and an upper platform above the door, which the Covenant also breaks through. There's also a few enemies that will go down from that upper level as well. But thankfully, Johnson, his machine gun turret, and all your allies make this fight pretty manageable on anything other than legendary difficulty. Once those guys are taken care of, we can get our hands on some Covenant weapons. Here they have the opposite approach to introducing us to the human weapons, with the only two weapons here being returning ones from ZE, the plasma pistol and plasma rifle in this case. Now heading into another hallway, this one is filled with debris, fire, and enemies. They're already giving some of that environmental storytelling, not just telling you that the Covenant are attacking, but immediately showing they're causing damage. I mean, outside of the door, they just destroyed. You know what I'm saying. At the end of the hallway, we'll go up these stairs to the next turret marine, and turning the corner, we have our next sort of battlefield, an open arena type of area. We've got beautiful windows giving us more great views of space and all that shit around us, and a few platforms we could jump onto and use stairs to walk onto, in addition a variety of enemies, which you always love. Typically, this is when I'm going to first use the turret, because that's the one where you could use it up on the high ground and there's nobody else using it, so you don't have to like take it from the Marine like you would earlier. Moving on from that, and behind these stairs, we can find our first introduction to the Magnum in Halo 2. While the common narrative is it's totally useless in Halo 2, and that definitely applies in multiplayer, in campaign it's a bit of a different story, as while it's definitely no like Halo CE Magnum by any means, it's still pretty effective for like headshots on grunts or when dual wielded with a plasma pistol. Heading up the stairs, we enter the first of several hangar rooms. This one is being actively boarded by the Covenant craft that are sending waves of enemies into the arena. You can either hop down there yourself and take the fight to them, or stay up high and pick them off. Once that's all cleared, heading out, we see the Malta, and we saw the Malta. Anyway, heading through another hallway, we enter a very similar hangar room, but this time the Covenant also has the upper platform. However, it's just a few grunts, so if you wanted to go up there, it's easy enough to get rid of them and stay up there. Yet again, another boarding craft from the Covenant will be sending multiple waves at us. Oh, and this room is actually our introduction to the plasma turret, if I'm not mistaken, which I don't know why, but I've always preferred it over the UNSC one in every Halo game. Looking out the window, and sadly, the Athens receives the same fate as the Malta. A few of the devs and the developers' commentary actually joked about how so many players would not have seen this or the Malta, but honestly, I'm a fan that it was like not a forced cutscene. I think it's a good way to respect the player's agency, and honestly makes the viewing of it more impactful, because you can miss it. So that means if you did witness it, you either A, got lucky, which is cool, or B, you actively sought it out, which obviously is going to be more impactful. Like, of course somebody is going to be more having fun with something that they actively sought out than something they were forced to watch, of course. Heading down on higher difficulties, this tunnel can be a bit of a challenge, just given how many enemies there are on both sides, but going through that and back up, we end up in Sergeant Gunn's room, and I immediately always rush to grab a shotgun and use it to avenge him personally. This is also our introduction to the shotgun, actually. So smoothly, if we've been paying attention, the UNSC weapons, we've already been introduced to 5 UNSC weapons in the first mission, which is the entirety. There are 5 UNSC weapons in all of CE. So, but it doesn't feel particularly rushed or anything, which is just chef's kiss, just beautiful. Here we enter another platform room with an overlooking turret like the other one, except this time the roles have reversed, and so now we're sort of on the low ground and the Covenant have the turrets in the high ground. Because of that, it's definitely going to be the more difficult of the 2 similar rooms. And once past that, we reunite with Johnson and his crew and then push into the halls, which eventually leads us into the vacuums of space, which is always fun to jump around in. And we also get these super cool looking jetpack elites to fight, which tragically didn't return for Halo 3. Still sad about that. Once back inside, this big room gives us a beautiful view of the Cairo Station's MAC gun, but don't get too distracted because as below, a swarm of drones are going to fly up and be a bit of a pain with all their plasma pistols spamming you, especially with that initial rush. But once they're done with, you can either wait for the elevator to come all the way up to you or just slide right down to it and waste no time clearing it before sending it right back down. And then, of course, once you're back down there, enter the vacuum of space yet again. And this little section is probably the most difficult area of the whole mission for myself personally, especially up. For all of these higher difficulties, obviously gets more difficult because you can't retreat. That door behind you locks. You have so little cover, and other than the extra BR ammo, all you have is what you've brought out there, and you just fought a bunch of enemies. So hopefully you restocked on stuff. Otherwise, you're kind of screwed. And then on higher difficulties, there's also going to be an extra couple jetpack elites that will come from behind the structures once you've beaten these initial 3 and gotten on top of that bridge, which is just always annoying, again, primarily due to lack of cover. Entering the elevator, it sends us down to the final room, which I always love the design of. It looks like a hangar, but totally unique compared to the earlier ones we fought through with all this machinery and moving parts going on. Of course, all the enemies down here are guarding that precious Covenant space pickle. And if you just chuck enough grenades at them, you can use them clustering up to your advantage, completing the introductory level to Halo 2. Which also, funnily enough, leads us into the only piece of cut content related to this level that I specifically wanted to take note of in this video, because as we've known for several years actually now, the end of this mission was going to look very differently in initial writings. You wouldn't destroy the Covenant ship in a cutscene with the space pickle, but rather you'd attach it to a Warthog, and then you would drive through like a Covenant ship. Hence the name of the cut level, Covenant ship. And there's even a tiny bit of cut content related to this idea. Well, we assume it's related to this idea, with the ability to attach a Warthog to a rail that kind of just, unfortunately, just leads into the void of empty space if you put in a few commands. Whilst I'm sad this was cut, as we go through the series, we'll see other cut missions that, in my opinion, are even more frustrating to have had sadly cut due to the infamous Halo 2 crunch. If you want a full breakdown of all that cut content on Cairo Station that I skipped, by the way, which is a lot, I'll link Vengeful Vanam's video on it in the description to it. That's all. Fun fact to start off with the tapping effect, that was actually done by Jen Taylor just tapping a light bulb next to her in her studio. I can't remember which Marty O'Donnell interview it was, but he mentioned that, and I thought it was neat. Yet again, starting off with 2 UNSC weapons not found in the first game, the BR and the SMG. However, something I forgot to mention last episode is, unlike in Halo CE, you don't have to betray your allies to get their weapons, so you could just trade with them, which is relevant to mention right now because Johnson is right next to you and he has a sniper, which honestly I always exchange for my SMG personally. Heading through this hallway and taking out the grunt, we enter a fantastically laid out holdout section, where after getting through the initial enemies and into the building, we're supposed to hold off against several waves of enemies, culminating in 2 hunters bursting down the door.
Hunters.
Second squad, this is Cortana. What is your status? Over.
Of course, by hopping up on the roofs, you can skip this entire section and the several corridor battles afterwards. But assuming you don't do that, if you have Vengeful Vanam's Halo 2 Uncut installed, we can get my favorite nugget of content in this mission. You'd get a great recreation of a cut in-game set piece that would play out before moving past the area where Johns would actually get picked up a little earlier. Here, let me show you that.
Hang tight, everyone. Help is inbound.
You heard the lady. Grab some dirt. Let him have it.
Sergeant, I need you on that bird. My Pelicans are going to start airlifting armor and reinforcements into the city. They'll need an escort that isn't afraid of a little hostile ground fire.
Understood. I'll keep an eye on him. Chief, good luck.
Heading down these narrow corridors, and these areas have been dubbed Sniper Alley for a reason. The number of Jackal snipers and their positioning is just so cruel. In addition, if you're messing around and trying to get the I would have been your daddy's skull, the fight for that is pretty tough too. So yeah, between those two things, this area is definitely the most difficult in the entire mission. Heading through this dark hallway, clearing out some grunts and elites, this level opens up a bit more and we can either take down all the enemies along on our road via foot if we want an extra challenge, or we could take the fight in a a warthog or a ghost, giving us our intro to the first vehicles in Halo 2's campaign. We'll run into some brand new vehicles later in the campaign, but none in this mission that we can use at least. As far as the two that are returning, by the way, the Warthog and the Ghost, I love the changes. No longer does the slightest boop destroy everything around you. The Warthog is a lot easier to handle, and the Ghost boost became a mainstay of the franchise for a reason. Both are just loads of fun and give us a good, familiar, but improved version of the vehicle sandbox we'll get into throughout the campaign. Alternatively, of course, with some skillful driving, you could just zoom past everyone, including this wide open area at the end, although personally I suggest getting into the Rockets building where the Marines are held out here before going into the tunnels, which, speaking of the Rockets, this is our introduction to them, and honestly, this is my favorite rocket launcher in the series. It has both the ability to lock onto both air and land vehicles, which in my opinion is how the rocket should have stayed on a mechanical level throughout the series. Just forget introducing the Spartan laser, just keep the rocket doing both of that. And that's how I personally, that's how I would have kept the sandbox balanced. The remainder of the level takes place in these tunnels, and it's up to you if you wish to bother taking out all or some of the enemies out, or just getting in a ghost and speeding past everyone like I've started doing a lot more lately, including a brand new vehicle made for only enemy NPCs, which is the Shadow that we'll pass. Of course, once we pass the end room, which has a bunch of shadows, I dub it the Shadow Transport Room, we go up out of the tunnels and end our first mission in the franchise on Earth, Outskirts. Metropolis is the first outright vehicle-focused level with basically the entire mission completable in a vehicle. Yes, even the Scarab fight at the end if you're stubborn enough. Now, of course, while we had some vehicles we could use in the previous mission, it was only light vehicles like the Warthog and the Ghost. But here, right off the bat, we get to use the Scorpion gifted by the lovely Johnson himself. And quite frankly, it's the best Scorpion in the franchise. The main driver gets use of a main cannon and a turret, both of which are far more accurate than in CE, and it has a decent amount of damage that it can take, and unlike the tank in Infinite, it controls super smooth and easy. Between this version of the Scorpion and a rocket that locked onto all types of vehicles, both land and flying, any map that had both was certainly not a good time for most players in most light vehicles like the Banshee, for example. Of course, if you're in a hurry, you can always take the Warthog left to the side at the start, or hijack one of the countless ghosts along with the bridge and zoom your way straight towards the end area with the Wraiths, especially on any difficulty lower than Legendary at least. However, assuming you take the Scorpion instead, you'll have yourself feeling like you're participating in a citywide siege almost, with you crossing the bridge under artillery fire of the Wraith to break past the first main hurdle, and then only for several banshees, goats, and 2 more wraiths to group up on you once you have reached the other side of the bridge, proving to be like a second, even more challenging barrier to break down. And then once in the tunnel, the final release diverges a little bit from what we got in the original ideas, because originally they wanted parts of the system to be flooded and they were kind of intended to be used as stealth and stuff down there. Major shout out to Vengeful Vidam, by the way, for sharing that information and even better replicating it so those on PC, if you install Halo 2 Uncut, you can experience that, or at least our best guess as to the original version for this gem of a game. It's a shame we didn't get it in the final product on release. Even if it was just a visual change and had no impact on stealth, it would have slightly helped these tunnels feel less monotonous, especially after spending the entire second half of the previous mission in endless identical looking tunnels. Once back outside, and we get so many Jackal snipers that on my first playthrough I thought they had an infinite respawn here, which thankfully was not the case, but still quite a lot of deadly snipers. Then you get more ghosts and wraiths blocking your path, which I would argue is the next major impasse you must get through. And once through this, we are not done yet, as we get to a downtown city area with even several more wraiths laying fire onto Marines on top of this building over here. And then personally, I always advise going to the side road up the hill and getting the rockets there to deal with the tanks. But between all those different holdout sections of the Covenant with heavy firepower and the wraiths that we cleared out in multiple areas earlier, it really shows how we are bit by bit chopping away at the Covenant's layers of defense. But we still have one more to crack before this area is safe. Heading up to the building and waiting patiently to get on the Scarab, where we have by far my worst performing area in this level. I'm not exaggerating when I say at least 80% of my deaths on this level are at this point. This area is just so cramped, and unlike the Scarab fights in Halo 3, the enemies on board are more numerous, more deadly, and where in those fights you could hop off the platform and run away and recover for health if you were able to escape enough gunfire or had a bubble shield or something. Here there is no such escape. Once you hop on here, you're effectively a prisoner until you're either dead or the entire Covenant crew is, because you can't jump off. Now don't misconstrue that as a complaint though, because given the overwhelming amount of firepower we were given for most of this mission that I just mentioned earlier, I feel like it was very appropriate to end it on a bit more of a challenge to make the whole level feel as it wasn't too much of a cakewalk or anything, especially for repeat playthroughs. So to summarize what I consider the first arc of Halo 2 before we move on to the first Arbiter missions next time, Chief has returned to the Earth and has now saved it, at least from the individual invasion fleet that we were just facing. Johnson, Hood, and Miranda are proving to be of help, giving Chief and Cortana a much more comfortable playing field, so to speak, than the sort of isolated rationing situation required in the first game. As players, we've been introduced to brand new weapons such as the carbine, beam rifle, SMG, battle rifle, and energy sword already, yet we still have many more to still utilize in later levels we've yet to be introduced to. And much like the weapons sandbox, we still have many more additions to the sandbox for vehicles from CE to get to. In fact, we've actually already seen every vehicle from CE return here, in addition to several new ones in just the first few levels of the game. While we are still pretty far from the end of the campaign, where the differences between the early design documents and the final product are most apparent, in terms of gameplay especially, we've seen several interesting ideas Bungie was thinking up that we didn't get for one reason or another in the final product. From more mechanics that interact with things like stealth in the flooded tunnels we talked about today, to driving the Covenant space pickle across the ship yourself in a whole mission rather than watching Chief do it in space in a cutscene, we're starting to see hints of just how limited the development team's ambitions were by not only the deadline, but also the hardware they were working on. Despite being by far my favorite game of all time, to know that the team had even higher expectations by a somewhat significant degree than what we got on release, it's just so inspiring. You just don't get that level of creativity and ambition unless you have a passion for what you are doing. And the love put into this game is just something I will never get over being excited about. As a reminder, I'm going over the missions in order first, and later we'll go back and cover the cutscenes, because quite honestly, there's so much to say about the cinematography of this game in general, that the cutscenes require an entire several dozen pages for proper analysis and appreciation per mission. So we start off following this crew of Covenant allies during a prelude section, which was the wise decision, going a full beach landing style type of mission in the start like Silent Cartographer from Combat Evolved, while putting players, in the shoes of an elite for the first time and all that might be a bit of too much sensory overload for some folks. Plus, it gives players a chance to sort of calm down and realize that, yeah, you just get to start this mission with a frickin' energy sword. No risking you're behind to get close to higher ranking elites or anything. Nope. Just, here you go, kid, have an energy sword. Thanks. It doesn't directly give you more damage or damage resistance by a significant margin, or at all, or stops vehicles, but it's a tool that gives the player an opportunity to initiate an encounter in countless ways which were just not previously possible. We can sneak past this group to the upper area and start attacking them from there. We can sneak up right behind them and assassinate them. We can wait until their pathing clusters them up as much as possible before throwing in a grenade, standing invisibility right next to them or above them. It's just great. Also, I love the Heretics designs. I wish 343 would bring back some of these designs more so in modern titles outside of just H2A, because these giant tanks on the grunts they stand out in a really cool way. And the breathers on the elites they look, well, equally badass and uncomfortable, to be honest. And now getting into this hangar room, and while it isn't the toughest fight we'll have in here during the Arbiter's mission on this gas facility, it's certainly not the type of room that you want to go charging in headfirst on in higher difficulties, because between the grunts who could blow you up, elites who barrage you with carbine fire, and the flying sentinels who are going to get you in almost every area of the arena, it's certainly not like an effortless task to clear out or anything like that. Leaving the hangar and the cool-looking ship in it, and heading down some corridors filled with baddies, we arrive at our next area, which not only looks cool, but it has some explosive crates that are going to roll through, so depending on how much you're paying attention to them, that could either be super difficult or super helpful. After more hallway combat afterwards, we arrive at this room, getting a good view of the Banshees outside, and a last encounter in here before starting the flying portion of the mission. And I love Bungie's solution to pacing in this area of the game. If you want to spend as much time as possible in the Banshee, you can follow the ship around, fighting enemies and hearing all the cool dialogue, whereas for returning players who wish to just move on, they can fly directly to the last area of the mission with far less resistance than the longer route of following the Phantom around. Even when I'm taking the shortcut through, I typically take a second or two though just to look up and down and admire just the exquisite work that they've done on the sandboxes, Bungie, which, I mean, they always do, but this one in particular I really love. It stands up really well even 20 years later. Oh, and one last thing of note is that this is the first time for most players that they're ever going to be able to get their hands on the fuel rod gun in the series, if they're playing, obviously, the games in order. And admittedly, given the Banshee-focused nature of the area and the infinite ammo on the Banshee bombs, this isn't the most optimal area to use it, but still, it has always been one of my favorite weapons in the entire franchise. The green and gold go so well together, the design is eye-catching, the audio design around it is nice, and even just the visual feedback of firing it is just something I'm a fan of. Here in this first hall, we would have gotten our first Juggernaut sighting, but they got cut. Despite that, the atmosphere is still appropriately ominous, though. After having a chat with a hologram you could smack the heck out of, fun fact, there's the first Flood encounter that we get in Halo 2. And given that it's only a few Flood forms and you have all these allies on your side, it's really no huge threat yet. Entering this elevator section, and expect to be here for quite a while. This thing moves very seldomly and very slowly. Plus, if you haven't fully cleared out the Sentinels or Flood forms on each sort of layer that they throw them at you, then the elevator will just refuse to move very often, which only slow things down even further. I mean, the concept, and to an extent, even the execution of this segment is actually, pretty good, but it just feels like it drags on for way too long. That's the main problem here, which is, it feels very uncharacteristic of Bungie's game design philosophy at the time. I mean, keep in mind, this was the same studio that had the quote-unquote 30 seconds of fun rule very famously. But eventually the elevator arrives at the bottom, and here we can continue on. Now this little arena is tough even in the final game, but had the Juggernauts not been cut, this would have been much harder, and this would have been the first fight against one down here, actually. Speaking of which, I highly advise staying up here and firing as much ammo as you can down there, as much as possible before you run out on everything before you go down there, or else you're going to quickly get overrun, particularly on higher difficulties. Clearing out of there and fighting through some hallways leads us back outside where even more Flood and Heretics stand in the way, some of them being pretty sneaky and hiding behind pillars too, but clearing them out leads us back to the next interior section. Here, Arby ends up separating from the group, and now we have to fight our way both up and down the station all alone with no ally support. Getting to the top to cut the cables, and I just love this gravity effect that happens when the station starts falling. Just little touches like this are always fun to play around with, especially physics stuff. But heading back downstairs and through even more hallways will lead us to the sort of bizarre 5-second flying segment. I'm not really sure why it was here, and I almost always forget it even exists until I run into it, but there you go. Finally reaching the end of the level in a very familiar looking hangar room, and we encounter our first of the 3 boss fights in Halo 2. Personally, I'd argue this is actually the least problematic in the game on a design level. It's not my favorite, but unlike the other bosses' gimmicks, which changed the combat formula rather significantly, this battle is effectively just a fight against several jetpack elites with a twist that some of them end up being just holograms, and so if you target the right one, you won't have to kill several of them, just one to win the fight. But otherwise, it much more appropriately fits the regular combat rhythm of the game much more, in my opinion. After that, defeating the heretic leader, and that brings us to the end of the mission.
We're getting into Delta Halo.
As shown in the intro cutscene, we get to start this mission off with a rocket launcher, and it's the first mission where we're given one right off the bat, no less. In addition, we also get our first look at jungle environments in Halo 2, and personally, I think it's a step up from CE. The first area on this new ring is an open field in front of this temple building that's neither necessarily too open nor too closed off. It's relatively easy to skip past, but I rarely do that. This arena has a really fun layout in addition to the composition of troops being really well varied and satisfying to fight against. For those that don't run off and stay, eventually we will even get a helpful Warthog dropped off by a Pelican to us. Regardless of if on foot or on the Warthog though, the view over the hill looking over this lake that we'll be traversing on this next level and the rest of this very level that we're on, it's just magnificent. Approaching a second arena, and this one is basically the opposite of the first. Rather than fighting uphill to a temple at the top of this, the temple that controls the bridge here is actually downhill, and instead of a balance between open and closed areas, all this space generally feels either way too open, or if you're inside the building, way too closed off. But getting into the building and activating the bridge does give us access to the other side. Beware when crossing, however, as a Banshee will fly in from behind you and can cause some trouble. Getting rid of the Banshee as well as the Wraith leads us to this beautiful waterfall area. Seriously, if these Halo rings weren't super weapons of galactic destruction, I'd consider a spot like this to be one of the most ideal places to live in the Halo universe. But getting back to the mission at hand, our next wave of enemies is guarding these tunnels with a combination of turrets, ghosts, and grenades. From grunts that are usually for the throw of the grenades, and with the turrets to jackals with the shields, but this little area ends up posing not too much of a threat. Entering yet another arena area, the third stone building area on this mission, and one I just absolutely love with the sheer variety of different ways one can go about getting through this area. You can use the sniper or the BR if you're a good shot to clear the way. If you hijack or bring a vehicle here, then you can blast through the areas where the enemies are spawning from, taking them out before they even get out of the door. Or of course, take on all the grunts, jackals, and elites on foot in almost any direction. Past the door into the temple, and here is this opening in the rocks where we get another very fun area to tackle in whatever way we wish. Originally, not only would we have to clear this area out getting into this valley here, but once upon a time there would have also been a phantom swinging by to give all these enemies even more support. This was cut in the final game somewhat sadly, but with that said, this area is still pretty challenging enough given the just sheer quantity of jackal snipers. Lastly, we get to this room with the Prophet of Truth hologram chanting, where there are several elite honor guards that are going to put up a pretty good fight, and that will bring us to the end of the level. Picking up in the same room we left off in last time, and keeping with the theme of mixing up encounters in unique ways, which is very consistent in this game, unlike all other previous drone fights, we get this group right off the bat as soon as we spawn in. Given how cramped this room is, though, the drones are even less of a threat than usual. And then heading outside the door, however, we're going to find enemies who are not so easy. This section between the starting room and the next building has several jackal snipers across the way who will instantly kill you if you so much as have the arrogance to face the enemies in front of your path. How dare you, right? But good note to play here is take the long-range weapon out and take your time sniping the jackals way over there before even thinking about taking on any enemies in the bridge area right ahead. The next interior building is even easier than the first, which leads us to this open stone platform packed with jackals and elites who, once defeated, are followed up by a pair of hunters who are dropped off by a phantom. Dealing with all that bunch, though, does reward us with a supply drop from a friendly pelican. And just in time, too, because we have gondola sections coming up in this level, the infamous Halo 2 gondolas. I mean, while I certainly understand the critique because there's certainly an abundance of gondola sections in Halo 2, I also don't mind them existing in general in the campaign as long as they were done well. This one being one of my best examples of how to do it right in my opinion. Not only can they make impressive set pieces, but it's an interesting temporary change to the combat formula of Halo as the platform provides a set and limited area to fight in, and there's no easy way to retreat. In this fight, unlike those ones in the Arbiter Flood missions, which in my opinion are not very fun, this respects our time by moving much faster, and in addition, by offering a far more, finally giving us some enemy variety with grunts on turrets, jackals with snipers, drones, and even jetpack elites. It's not just sentinels and flood, sentinels and flood, sentinels and flood. There's a little bit of variety, and it doesn't take forever. Once arriving to the tower at the other side, and I like to immediately get my second favorite Halo 2 weapon, which is the fuel rod from the grunt upstairs here. And then I typically am going to use that, but use whatever you like, obviously, to clear the tower down here. And then that's going to help you get to the elevator, which obviously sends up reinforcements once you clear this building out. And that's going to give you a route forward. And quite a beautiful one at that. I mean, even in the original graphics, this underwater area just looks magical. Getting off the elevator sees us in the building filled with, we were just previously talking about my second favorite weapon. Here we'll find my favorite weapon with a bunch of weapon racks and elites carrying a bunch of energy swords. The very iconic and legendary weapon of this game very much. It may not be exactly useful in this uphill area getting out of the building, but that's what I typically would have grabbed the fuel rod for, as the amount of plasma raining down on you here is just way too much to charge head on through unless you're on easy or normal difficulty. Luckily enough for us, we get a second ammo drop in the same mission. For good reason too, as this next area has a ton of fallen debris for sword elites to hide behind, and plasma grenade throwing grunts, as well as a few good open sight lines for jackal snipers, in addition to the phantom that comes down to drop off reinforcements, which is going to force you to take cover. And then unlike the first gondola run, once you clear that area, you get a second gondola run, which does not give you nearly the same enemy variety as the earlier one. And one thing I will give it, though, is to compensate for that, it is shorter and with less total encounters, getting us to our destination in a fairly timely manner. Now this is it. Entering this building sees us as the chief facing off against a prophet for the first time, and honestly, I don't see why so many people are going to give this fight flack, both when it came out and even nowadays, because honestly, I've always considered it kind of a really hype moment. I mean, you have countless spawning enemies throwing plasma grenades and plasma shots at you, in addition to the sword elite honor guards chasing you down, whilst on top of all of that, you're trying to locate this floating chair laser beam guy, trying to literally punch him out of his throne. I mean, I loved it as a kid, and still to this day, it's one of the better boss battles in the Halo franchise in my eyes. And whilst on final release, the mission ends here, and we get right to the cutscene. Apparently, originally, you would have had to have fought your way out of the chaos, which I'm unsure why they cut. It honestly was a major narrative moment to give the player agency, and at very little cost, resource or time-wise, so not sure about that. But yeah, hope you liked it. Throughout this level, we'll be encountering these energy pillars that are going to block the way, which I always thought was a neat little idea to mix traversal up, even if it's subtle. This first fall is pretty short, but some of these tunnels we drop down can admittedly be a bit annoyingly long on repeat playthroughs later in the mission. And then in this first room, if you stay around, then the first fights of the mission actually start here with the sentinel deployer that's very easy to destroy. However, usually I admittedly just walk right past them. Dropping down another level gives us our first encounter with arguably one of my favorite additions in any series of battles. We get jackal and grunt allies. I love these silly guys. The grunts are always having fun dialogue, of course, and I've always had the jackals as my second favorite species in the Covenant, just behind the elites. So to team up with them while getting to play as none other than the Arbiter himself, needless to say, it feels pretty cool. And then after clearing out that space, we enter a near identical hallway to the one where we could have had our first Sentinel encounters if we stuck around a bit. This hallway, of course, is also likewise being filled with sentinel enemies. Continuing further down, and side note on these pillars, I always found it interesting how you could open them in 3 separate ways. You could, of course, simply press X when prompted to, but you could also punch or shoot the glyph several times to open it. I don't know, I just thought it was a unique touch. And I don't know if it's because it's so empty and well lit or what, but entering this room always felt like I was entering this grand, iconic area. It's just yet another case of the developers using design to communicate to us the traits and ideal of the Forerunners, you know, very much under the show don't tell category. And then this big Sentinel Enforcer here actually doesn't even need to be destroyed by you necessarily, as once you unlock all the 4 pillars of the gondola, it automatically explodes, which honestly, it's convenient for harder difficulties, but kind of a bizarre decision in my opinion, admittedly. Here, Bungie gives us a pause in the action so we could soak up this absolutely gorgeous view. I mean, geez, still 20 years later, and even in the original graphics, I get goosebumps from this view right here. Bungie seriously never fails to deliver on stunning skyboxes when needed. Now, once you lift up to this new arena, this by far is going to be the most challenging spot in this level, at least for myself. Between the Sentinel Enforcer, regular and upgraded Sentinel spawning, in addition to the swarm of Flood with nowhere to run to, yeah, this could quickly get overwhelming, especially when the Enforcer starts firing its rockets. And geez, your whole screen just starts shaking like your TV got struck by ground unused earthquake or something, which just makes focusing on anything immeasurably difficult, needless to say. The best method I've found is to stay on the lower floor for as long as possible until you have enough firepower, ideally, typically with the plasma grenades, to quickly take out the Enforcer, but even then you have to rely on some slight luck because seemingly, and I don't have math to back this up, but it feels like roughly 10% of the time all the Flood will just concentrate on you in the corner below them, and not the mass of sentinels that are literally firing right above them at their heads. I don't know why they randomly do this, I just know it's something to be aware of. After another drop down a tunnel, we're immediately greeted by a very familiar fog. Just when fighting sentinels was starting to feel a little repetitive, the dev gave us some good Flood to mix it up. And unlike those we fought on Threshold during the last series of missions as the Arbiter, here the Flood are infecting humans, giving the enemy encounters a very different dynamic because the human weapons are obviously more focused on health damage rather than shield damage like the plasma ones, which was pretty much exclusively what you were using in the previous series of missions as the Arbiter. And that, of course, is also going to mix up the sandbox in a way that's much more akin to what's in the Master Chief missions, where you have a good variety of Covenant and UNSC weapons to choose from. Thankfully, this mission is not as lengthy or repetitive as the library from CE, so this section doesn't overstay its welcome. Although, this annoyingly long tunnel part sure does. And finally, we are free and outside. Us with our elite allies now get to destroy this Flood and the beautiful snowy landscape, which not only looks good, but does some good subtle storytelling, as making areas colder to attempt to slow the spread of the Flood is actually a very commonly used tactics by machines and sentinels alike on Forerunner installations. Kind of like the one we're on right now. This last standoff area used to be one of my favorite places where you were meant to hold out against several enemy waves in the campaign. But I'm not sure if this is an MCC bug or a legacy glitch I was just lucky enough to never encounter, but nowadays this mission struggles to properly end because Flood forms often get stuck on roofs or in pits around this area, and it's very difficult to find them, let alone be able to get some shots in them at whatever angle or weird spot they're at to end the mission and load the ending cutscene. But otherwise, I absolutely adore this level. We're picking up where we left off with the Arbiter and the mission amidst the snow on Delta Halo, so let's get right into it. A word to the wise, on MCC, don't immediately hop into a vehicle, as during the first enemy encounter, an Enforcer will come up very early on, and it just loves to grab and crush whatever vehicle you're in. In the original, it doesn't do that nearly as often as you can see here, but on MCC it's definitely far more aggressive with that from what I've found. So once that's taken care of, I typically am then going to hop onto my favorite vehicle personally in Halo, which is the Spectre, although if you wish to not rely on an ally, then of course you could always hop in the Ghost instead. Now this room is a fun challenge up here, as we have 3 Enforcer Sentinels, multiple Flood, and a variety of vehicles including tanks and several regular Sentinels on top of all of that. You can go slow and methodical, taking out each individually as you move up, or head straight to the rocket launcher like I typically do to get rid of the tanks and Enforcers first, making the rest of the fights a lot easier. And the Sentinels just keep coming, with this courtyard area having more regular and Enforcer Sentinels in addition to a small group of combat Flood forms. Honestly, I just skip past this area, just like whenever I'm on a Ghost or anything at this point, or the Spectre either, or as long as I have a vehicle, I just zoom right out of here. And then this next area is interesting as it's also filled with a lot of powerful enemies, yet they're a lot more active when fighting each other. So for the most part, the quicker you move, the easier it is to get past this area typically. I mean, between the Wraiths, Enforcers, and rocket-wielding Flood, it's a pretty dangerous area to hang around in for too long, you know. Hang through the tunnel here, and we see the ruins of that crashed ship that was actually in the skybox of the previous level, and it's actually just all ablaze, obviously in a wreck now. It's currently the battleground between the Flood and the Sentinels, and sadly, at this block ahead, if we're in any big vehicle, at the very least like a tank, we're gonna have to go on without it and ditch it here, sadly. But we will have another tank segment later, so don't you worry. Continuing on leads us to this first of 2 similar styled rooms that we will come across on this level, each with progressively more Flood and Sentinels in between the areas. And so if you see this one here, the second one, it has no Sentinel beam lights or firing sound, unlike the first one that we just saw. It's just quiet and dark. Well, at least in Stuttgart. Once you start attacking the Flood, obviously it's no longer quiet, but you get the point. Thankfully, we didn't have to ditch the tanks for that long, as yet again we get another tank section, as I promised earlier. You could hijack the Wraith if you really wanted, or simply take the Scorpion in the corner of the area here. Of course, the lighter vehicles are going both on foot or both an option, although certainly not the easier ones, as this run is going to see us push past more Enforcers, Wraiths, Ghosts, Warthogs, and much more. After our second tank run in the mission comes to an end, we get to go up this platform to begin the gondola section. Speedrunners and often many repeat players will kind of cheese this by finding spots on this where they can hide where the Flood won't be able to reach them. But personally, I always find using the sword and the shotgun against just countless waves of Flood always so much fun that I find it too hard to resist, and that's typically what I'm going to do when I'm on this gondola, even though I repeat this campaign many times. I mean, this section will ultimately be the last combat section of the level, so why not, you know? I mean, obviously, I get why not for the speedrunners, but, like, you know what I'm saying, like, repeat players. Personally, I'm always just gonna fight this part, or even though most players probably would, and not too many repeat playthroughs, or at least as many repeat playthroughs as I do. Here we enter the Forerunner facility for the Icon finally, with the Flood and bodies already on the ground scarcely, which leads us to the concluding cutscene of this mission, and thus hiding in a grave mine, and this starting room is infamous, and for good reason. Literally within the first few frames of starting, you're taking fire from multiple brutes. Combined with several waves of enemies afterwards in this room, and only starting with the Needler, well, needless to say, it's a significant challenge. You do get some reprieve once you can get your hands on the carbine, but until then it's going to be rough sailing. And heading through this nice room with the plants and banners leads us into this balcony area where we get this stunning view of High Charity, and the waves out here are manageable given the weapons and space to work in within this area. Down the first grav lift, past the jackals, an identical room to the one we just went through gets us into this next arena, a small circular room with another grav lift that will afterwards eventually lead us to the prison section. And then here there are 2 groups of captured Marines, each on a separate floor, and we are of course tasked with freeing them while the Covenant sends down multiple reinforcements through the same lifts that we just used to get down. And then once having saved our pals, we head up the same way we came in, the big grav lift. Back upstairs, and the hallways get a lot more intense compared to earlier in the mission, as it becomes a 3-way fight between you, the elites, and the Covenant loyalists, all fighting one another. and then entering a third room with this identical layout, except this time with hunters. And word of the wise, beware of the crates in this room because the hunters will almost certainly kill you by flinging those around. Past them, we finally enter back outside, and here we have a wide and rocky arena with several good high points to take position at overlooking the lower central portion. We have brutes, jetpack elites, regular elites, jackal snipers, and hunters in here, so going in guns blazing on higher difficulties is definitely not recommended. And then lastly, we get this pretty epic, awesome set piece of in Emberclad roaring by and shaking the screen, and now being purely inhabited only by the forms of flood that are flying it, obviously. In this next arena, we have even more Uprising Bungie starts us off on one of these beautiful honestly, skyboxes the area around
something
here,
all
all the
Halo games
citadel, and the
universally
water and
impressed me
everything,
with.
which following
These
along the
beautiful
only
outdoor
path forward
areas
leads us
overlooking
to a
the
city
city
of
of
murdered by
murdered
the
by the
brutes,
brutes,
just
uses
simply
his
magical.
last breath to warn us.
Speaking of repeating
the
runes
Arbiter
earlier, here
about
we get
what's coming
basically
up
a
ahead.
second rocky arena section,
And around the
like
corner
one
we
just
start
had
encountering
earlier
the
with a
brutes
few
who killed
slate
them,
all
who are
scattered
scattered
all
all
across
out
here,
enemies
all the way up
until
until
the
the
door
door
of
of that,
that,
going back
and
through
being
more
careful
corridors
not
leads
to be
us to
knocked
this
over
over
the
the ledge or any Benjamin starts kicking in. We are then
and
rewarded
both sides of the
elite
great
reinforcements,
start
in
throwing
particular
everything they've
zealots
got
working
down
down
in
to
their
their
own
own
drop
drop pods,
pods,
and they're going to be just
always
very
a fun
helpful in
time.
this upcoming cave because it's
And
packed
after
with
this room of
jackals,
chaos, we simply
drones,
defeat this
and
guy at the
brutes, all of
exit
which
and
have
finish the
very
level.
good angles of attack to hit you from. Once you get past that, then entering this room here right away gives us an encounter which one of the several we'll be getting as we traverse the Forerunner tunnel system afterwards. Back outside and clearing these guys out gives us our first in-vehicle access in the mission, which gives us a ghost over here. Unfortunately, this first arena after we get the ghost has a bunch of snipers and brute shots all over the place, so the ghost has a really uphill battle here on legendary difficulty. Any other lower difficulty though, it's a lot easier to just drive past them. And moving on past rivers and more valley arenas leads us all the way to this arena with 2 wraiths, a handful of sniper jackals, and at least a dozen brutes. It's a lot, but the gear you've gotten to this point should be more than enough to tackle them. And then lastly, we blast our way through this cave to conclude the Arbiter's penultimate mission. We begin the level with a carbine and a plasma pistol combo as the Flood and Covenant begin fighting one another ahead of us. And then once we get back inside, the enemies from each side are of course going to be all over the place, so keep a sword or shotgun handy for these closer quarters. Up the scrab lift to the next area leads us into this beautiful wide open arena where we have to make our way across, of course. And while the buggers and flood in here can be a bit annoying to deal with, if you pace yourself and take them out mostly from a distance, then they should be no real issue, even in higher difficulties, to be honest. Fun lore fact, by the way, actually, these shards of glass that are hanging down from the ceiling, these are actually shards of glass collected from the several planets that the Covenants have glassed in their violent, brutal expansion across the galaxy. The following hallways are dark and unsurprisingly thus thick with flood, so don't forget about your flashlight while you're in here, as it's obviously made for moments like this. And then continuing on, and the city of High Charity just looks a lot worse off than even just the previous Master Chief mission. And continuing on through it and up the elevator here puts us in a pretty tough combat zone. I would argue the toughest combat zone of this mission. There's not a lot of cover nor a lot of power weapons, yet the enemies here are plentiful with power weapons and cover and strong. They're also pretty aggressive too and are going to chase you even when you're behind cover, so be prepared for all of that. Next, make sure to grab the energy sword while on the central pedestal here, even if you have an energy sword, just to replenish it in this pretty cool looking room, which, side note, honestly probably the coolest looking room in any of the High Charity levels in my opinion. I don't know if it's just the broken glass or what, but it's just a cool looking area. But yeah, anyways. One final gravity lift brings us to this last series of battles in the Halo 2 campaign as the Chief himself. You can, of course, speed right past these guys if you wish to, right to the end, but I prefer to stick around and fight the several waves of them, even if they keep respawning for quite a while. That's just how I prefer to play through it. But yeah, with that we have completed the summaries of the layout for every single Master Chief mission in Halo 2. We start with the Great Journey with some pretty good vehicle options, those being the Spectre and the Wraith in this case. And the first set of encounters all take place at the bottom of these valleys against all sort of Covenant vehicles, you know, ghosts and other specters and wraiths, etc., as well as brute ground troops. Passing under the Scarab here leads us into the first interior section, and this part is actually pretty special as we get none other than 2 Hunter allies for this section, which is not just unique to the campaign of Halo 2, but the entire Halo franchise actually. Passing over this bridge packed with drone and jackals gets us back inside where we enter a Covenant prison section, And unlike the prison section with Master Chief and High Charity, you aren't required to free your imprisoned allies, which, in my opinion, actually makes the act of deciding to free them all the more impactful, quite frankly. I mean, after all, it's not a requirement, so doing so does separate your playthrough ever so slightly from players who don't, and I think that's pretty cool. Arriving on the Scarab platform here sees us allying with Johnson inside Scarab, of course, and by giving him some Banshee cover, we get to help him make his way to the doors where Tartarus is behind to bust them down. And of course the Banshee section sees us flying through a very similar valley to the one at the start of the mission, in fact, and includes all the same enemies on top of turrets on top of the valley, as well as several Banshees being thrown in as well. Defeating all the enemies in the valley and the beach here gives Johnson the space to finally fire the Scarab gun at the locked door, blasting way through for us. And then once inside, there's only a small group of brute guards that we have to get past before confronting Tartarus himself, and one final boss battle to conclude the gameplay of Halo 2's campaign. A few words of advice when it comes to this fight in particular is it can easily be the most difficult in the campaign if you take the wrong approach. So please do not do what my friend and I did on our Halo 2 Legendary playthrough, where we went in with no preparations whatsoever. I think in total it took us around 6 hours to beat the entire campaign on Legendary, but the Tartarus fight alone made up more than an hour and a half of that time easily. So first off, bring a vehicle. We didn't do that. Most people I see tend to like to bring the Spectre, but personally I prefer to bring the Banshee. It's just my preference, but either of course will help you. And then second, bring beam rifles. We both thought back then that only Johnson actually could affect the shield of Tartarus, but no, you can as well, so take advantage of that. And then that's not even getting on top of Johnson clothing, but honestly, just these two easy steps without Johnson clothing are more than enough to have likely making that fight take less than half an hour on it, just for us alone on Legendary, and for you, perhaps even less. Well, likely even less. Analysis series. Yeah. We're going to go over the weapons sandbox, but I thought I would do something different because if you wanted like just sort of general info, there's obviously of course the wikis and so many other videos that have gone over that. And as far as how they work in competitive, there's also many other videos about that. So the only interesting thing that I thought I could contribute as far as the discussion around the weapons sandbox is concerned is just give my sort of tier list of what I like and why. So we're going to do that, and hope you enjoy it. Oh, also before we begin, one other thing of note is that originally I intended for this to be a tier list with 7 tiers going S, A, B, C, D, E, and F, but when I really thought about it and tried placing at least one weapon per tier list, per tier in the tier list, I just found that there are no weapons that I consider E or F tier in the Halo sandbox, so D is going to be the lowest tier in this tier list, so it'll only be 5 tiers. So we're going to split this up going faction by faction, alphabetically within per faction. So starting off with the UNSC, and honestly I'd put the battle rifle somewhere, I'd put it at B tier. I think that's roughly where I'd put it. It's not my favorite weapon in the game, it's not my least favorite, but it's middle of the road. It's fun to use, but it's also very common. Obviously the 3-shot burst is very handy, and there are a lot of great combos with it, BXB being the most notable of course. But yeah, I think that's a good spot to put it. And then next, the Magnum. I'd put the Magnum at C tier. I know as far as strength-wise it's pretty bad, but because of that it makes me... it's really fun to use, you know what I'm saying? Because everybody ignores it, nobody uses it. It's absolutely awful. Unless you're playing campaign on normal or easy, it is an overwhelming challenge. I don't want to say it's impossible to get kills with it, but it's pretty damn difficult on Heroic and Legendary. And in actual multiplayer matches, unless you're playing with people that are completely inexperienced, likewise it's pretty difficult, but it looks cool and it sounds cool. So we're judging these based on how much I like them, so it's definitely not the bottom tier. I'd give it C. And then after that, the rocket launcher. Oh boy. I'd put that just below S tier at A tier. It's great sound design, super handy, arguably the most useful rocket launcher in the series, being able to lock onto both flying and land vehicles, and does so pretty well in my opinion. Yeah, nothing much more to say to it. The only reason I'm not putting it on an S tier is because there's nothing that like wows me about its design. It's pretty cool, but you know what I'm saying? So S is for absolutely perfect all across the board, and the rocket launcher is pretty cool, but not quite perfect in my opinion. And the SMG, I'd probably put the SMG along with the Magnum. Same sort of deal, not particularly useful, but really great sound design, looks pretty cool, and fun to use when you can on lower difficulties or against players that aren't super experienced. Yeah, not much more to say about that one. Next, the sniper rifle. Oh man, geez, the Halo 2 sniper rifle is very, very iconic for a good reason. It's a dominating weapon on the battlefield, especially for people who are really good with using it, obviously. Sound design is really great, and it's relatively common as far as the multiplayer is concerned, and the campaign less so, but it's pretty good. I'd put it at B tier. I think there are a couple other sniper rifles in the series that have better design as far as visual is concerned, and a few that are a little bit easier to use, but yeah, especially the sound design as far as this game is concerned, it knocks it out of the park. So, and oh geez, I skipped over one UNSC weapon. I skipped over the shotgun. That's a shame, because I'd put the shotgun right up in A tier. It's the best looking shotgun in the series in my opinion. Not as strong as the CE shotgun, but it's still definitely pretty powerful. It's inarguably a power weapon in my opinion, still, even in the Halo 2 sandbox, both in campaign and multiplayer, especially campaign. Geez, I mean, the flood levels are effectively shotgun levels, and sound design, mechanics, all good. I love the green lights on it. That's what I think it should have, not the blue ones. I like the green ones better. So yeah, putting the shotgun up in A tier. Now switching over to the Covenant, and we're going to include the Sentinel Beam under the Covenant as well, just because otherwise there'd only be one Forerunner weapon. So yeah, we're just going to throw that in here. And starting off with the beam rifle, I'd put the beam rifle at B tier with the sniper rifle. I think it looks cooler than the sniper rifle, but as far as effectiveness and ease of use, it's about the same. It has some strengths and weaknesses that the sniper don't have, and vice versa, so I think they balance each other out fairly well. I think the sniper sounds cooler sound design wise, but I think the beam rifle looks cooler, and so again, they balance out overall, both mechanically in my opinion, and definitely as far as favoritism, which is what this tier list is obviously all about. So I'd throw them at B tier, put the beam rifle with the sniper and the battle rifles as well. And then up next, the brute plasma rifle. This is going to be one of our two D tier weapons. I know I said earlier I originally thought of having this as having 7 tiers and having E and F tier, but the sandbox just doesn't have any E or F tier weapons. But I think the brute plasma rifle is probably my least favorite weapon in Halo 2. It looks cool, the idea of it is cool, but well, let me put it this way. The idea of having a brute plasma rifle is interesting, but how they made it mechanically I don't think is particularly interesting. And yeah, it doesn't show up a whole lot in campaign or multiplayer. It doesn't have a lot of use, and it has the same exact, obviously, sound design as the Elite one. It would be nice if they did like maybe a little bit more sound design variation and a little bit more aesthetic variation other than just changing the color. So yeah, I'd put that at D tier. And then after that, we've got the brute shot. I'd probably put the brute shot a tier above that at C tier. The melee capability of it is pretty cool, and its ability to launch objects around is pretty cool. But that's about where things that I like about it end. I don't hate the weapon, obviously. Those things are pretty helpful, but I'm not crazy about the visual design as far as that's concerned. The sound design's not bad, not good. It's not like, I don't know, it's not as satisfying to me audibly as some of the other weapon sound effects. And oh my goodness, it being used against you can be a real pain in the behind, especially on higher difficulties, given how brute-centric some of the campaign levels can get. So I'd put that at probably B tier for how much I like it. The carbine is probably my favorite single shot weapon in all of Halo, as far as the rifles are concerned, at least. Halo 2 carbine is my absolute favorite. The visual design is just absolutely awesome. It's pretty good to use. I know I'm like a competitive level, everybody prefers the battle rifle, but on a more casual level, and especially going through the campaign, it's just as good as the carbine. And in my opinion, from that perspective, because obviously I'm not a competitive player, it's effectively the battle rifle, except it looks cooler, and it sounds cooler, and it has more ammo, or at least has better ammo usage. So I put that straight up in S tier, especially because it's one of the most iconic weapons that's most affiliated with the Arbiter, other than the energy sword, of course, which we'll get to. And so, actually, speaking of which, the pardon me, the energy sword is right after it, and the Halo 2 energy sword is, as far as all weapons are concerned, my favorite in the entire Halo franchise. Being able to sword fly and just whipping it on and swinging right away. And oh my goodness, the Halo 2 energy sword just had so much mobility and usage, both adjacent and sometimes not even directly affiliated at all with combat, on top of obviously it being very effective in combat, that it just made it so fun to use. And of course visually sounds cool, that, you know, play that sound effect now. That sound is just super cool. The visuals are epic. It's one of the most iconic laser energy futuristic swords in all of franchise building outside of lightsabers, you know what I'm saying? And for a good reason too. And of course, being a big Arbiter fan, it's the weapon that is the most affiliated with him, I would argue. And that definitely bought it some favors with me, especially I'm a big Elite fan, and of course that's also a weapon heavily affiliated with just the species as a whole. So yeah, I'd put that in S tier. And then the third and final S tier, I promise not all the Covenant weapons are going to be S tier, just alphabetically, this is how it worked out, I promise, is the Fuel Rod. The Fuel Rod with the gold and green, I think that's a really good color combo going on. Its rarity ironically made it more appealing to me, especially because when you played the original Halo 2 on multiplayer, I don't recall it being accessible like on the OG Xbox at all in multiplayer, and the only time you could get it was in the campaign on a couple Arbiter missions. And so it was a very niche weapon that didn't show up a lot, and sort of made it a rarity and a interesting sort of thing of note when you got to use it. And obviously it's pretty powerful, not quite as strong as the rocket because it didn't have the lock-on capability, but it had its own strengths as far as being able to fire more shots and have them arc if you knew what you were doing. It was kind of like the Scorpion and the Wraith, you know what I'm saying? Generally speaking, the Scorpion is better, but if you know what you're doing and the person in the Scorpion is either average or below average, you could do some clever tricks to actually come out on top. And likewise with the Fuel Rod. Sound design, obviously, great as well. And yeah, S tier for me. And then next after that is the Needler. The Needler is one of the most iconic weapons in Halo, and I love it. I love that it's been a consistent weapon in the franchise because it's a unique design and sort of mechanics that separates it from a lot of the other weapons. And oh gosh, I forgot the name of the needles, but the Blamite or whatever, they're just so cool looking, and the idea of that, these crystals that like target people and then explode when you get too many of them clustered up, that's just so neat. I love that mechanic. And the sound design is pretty good, but mechanically it's it's pretty rough. And as far as visual design, there are definitely some better looking Needlers that we'll see later in the franchise. So with all things in balance, I'd probably put it as our final weapon in the B tier. And then going on after that, the Plasma Pistol. The Plasma Pistol, okay. I am going to say some controversial things that are going to make many classic Halo 2 fans very upset. But I would put, as far as, again, this tier list is how much I enjoy these weapons and just overall vibes, it's the one other weapon that goes in the D tier for me with the Brute Plasma Rifle. The sound design is really good, but I think the utility of being able to stop vehicles really really changed the game in a positive way in later Halo games, and not having that is a big hindrance. And simultaneously, with how hyper aggressive it is at targeting people, it felt, this is going to sound disrespectful, but it felt a lot less skillful in a way, or at least a lot less intricate to work with, a lot less cleverness, sort of, you know what I'm saying, when it comes to finding a way to make use of it, or at least less utility. It's just very straightforward. Hold it down, and then if you get a second of a peek at a person, it'll immediately home into them and hit them, and then a headshot every single time. And I didn't find that very appealing, gameplay-wise, both to be used against me or to use against others. Visually, we'll see a lot cooler plasma pistols, especially with like the H2A and the Halo Reach model. That's like gorgeous. But again, sound design, they hit it out of the park, at least. I'll give them that. But overall, I would put the plasma pistol at D tier because it's kind of the opposite of the fuel rod sort of situation. It's arguably the most common weapon in the entire game, and so you see it and you sort of get, or at least I sort of get sick of it. It's not that useful for how I like to play the game, and it's, yeah, I don't hate it, but overall, I'd put it in D tier. Sorry. And the plasma rifle, sort of almost the exact antithesis of an opinion here. I actually have it up in A tier. I love the sound design. I think the plasma rifle in Halo 2 is probably my favorite looking plasma rifle in the series as well. As far as mechanics are concerned, it could be a little bit more powerful, but I will say of all the dual wieldable weapons, it is, from my experience at least, and a couple other players have said this as well, the most effective to be used on its own as a singly held weapon out of, again, all the weapons that could be dual wieldable, which isn't necessarily like something you want to hang your hat on, but it is a strength of it for sure. And very similar to the carbine and the energy sword, it's a weapon very heavily symbolically affiliated with the elites and the arbiter, and so because of that, obviously I'm going to like it and be a big fan of it. And so yeah, I believe that is all the weapons. So, oh, also I almost forgot about the Sentinel Beam. The Sentinel Beam, I'd probably put it in C tier. It can be a bit frustrating to use, but it looks really cool, and yeah, I think that's an appropriate balance to put it at, as far as how much I like it, at least. Well, today we are finally going over the audio design in the original release of Halo 2, and that's going to include music, sound effects, and dialogue. So despite Halo 4 and 5 diverging from a lot of the traditional Halo melodies and stuff like that, Halo 2, in my opinion, arguably has the most musically diverse and experimental soundtrack in the mainline series. In CE and Halo 3, you can count the amount of time you hear an electric guitar on one hand, but in Halo 2 you hear it in the startup menu, in High Charity during the Great Schism, in Arbiter's Banshee section against the Heretics, in the post-Scarab destruction scene on Metropolis, in the fight against the flood vehicle drivers on Quarantine Zone, in the end credits. Hell, there are even songs that are released on the soundtrack of it that didn't ship with the actual game itself. Also, Halo 2 has just an incredibly diverse electronic musical palette, using the keyboards and synthesizers to partially represent the Covenant, Forerunners, Heretics, Rebelling Elites, UNSC, and the Flood. I haven't measured this exactly, but based on my recollection, it's also one of the most balanced in terms of how many songs are evolutions of a previous game's song versus brand new compositions. So Reach, for example, leaned more towards new compositions, whereas Halo 3 leaned more towards the opposite. And at 2 hours, 18 minutes, and 8 seconds in total, there's plenty of songs to sink your teeth into when it comes to the Halo 2 soundtrack, so there's a lot to enjoy. Rather than go over every single song, let's just categorize them into types to briefly go over each one. That's my favorite in each category as an example. So first off, as previously mentioned, are what we'll call the rock songs, aka anything in the OST with an electric guitar, basically. So outside of John Mayer's version of Impen, they all pretty much fit a common theme of being primarily used as not just combat music, but more specifically vehicle combat music. The Mjolnir mix of the main theme is a perfect example. Here it is playing during the Arbiter's fight against the heretics.
One by one until we find the heretic leader.
The next category is electronic ambience, and this is mostly atmospheric music with almost if not exclusively electronic non-orchestral sounds, such as in Jewel Toll on Cairo Station.
All hands, brace for impact.
After that, we have what I'll call the epic category. This is orchestral-based music used to accompany combat, moments of triumph, etc., such as here during the cutscene where Chief is at the award ceremony on Cairo Station.
Gentlemen, we're lucky to have you back.
The last distinct category is what we'll call the monastic orchestral. This is the majority of the main menu music as well as any other somber moments during the story. Much like the previous category, the instrumentation is very traditionally orchestral based, but playing calmer melodies on lighter tones with a very strong presence of choir chants. Here's a fantastic example of that when Chief has to leave Cortana behind on High Charity.
That structure in the center of the city, it's a Forerunner ship. And Truth is heading straight for it. If he leads the Covenant fleet to Earth, they won't stand a chance. You have to stop him.
That brute has the Index. And Miranda and Johnson. He can activate the ring.
If he does, I'll detonate in Emberclad's reactor just like we did the Autumns. The blast will destroy this city and the ring. Not a very original plan, but we know it'll work. No, I don't want to chance a remote detonation. I need to stay here.
Beyond just the music, the sound effects are a great showcase of balancing unique as well as stock sound effects. Almost every little sound from doors opening to charging up weapons have become well-loved sounds by the entire community. Some sounds were brought straight from CE, such as the plasma pistol, while others are brand new sounds that would become staples of the franchise, like the energy sword. Lastly, the dialogue is exquisite. Not only is the writing for said dialogue arguably the best in the entire franchise, but just like with every Halo game, they knocked it out of the park in terms of casting. Of course, the voice actors themselves were also on top of their game, giving flawless performances across the board. So here, let's just listen to a handful of some of the best lines.
The message just repeats. Regret, regret, regret.
Any idea what it means?
Dear humanity, we regret being alien masters. We regret coming to Earth.
And we most definitely regret the Corps just blew up our raggedy-ass fleet! Hoorah!
What would you have your Arbiter do?
Master Chief, defend this station.
Yes, sir. I need a weapon.
Right this way.
Just one question. What if you miss?
I won't.
There are things about Halo even the Hierarchs do not understand. Take care, Arbiter. What you say is heresy. Is it? Oracle, what is Halo's purpose?
Collectively, the Seven.
Wrong! Not another word!
Please. Don't shake the light bulb. If you want to keep your brain inside your head, I tell those boys to chill. Go ahead. Do your thing.
The sacred rings, what are they?
Weapons of last resort, built by the Forerunners to eliminate potential flood hosts, thereby rendering the parasite harmless.
And those who made the rings? What happened to the Forerunners?
After exhausting every other strategic option, my creators activated the rings. They and all additional sentient life in 3 radii of the galactic center died as planned. Would you like to see the relevant data?
Tartarus, the prophets have betrayed us.
Relax. I'd rather not piss this thing off.
Please learn of this. They will take your head when they learn. Fool. They ordered me to do it.
Suffice to say, I recommend any aspiring audio/music folks to study the Halo 2 sound design very thoroughly, regardless of which industry you tend to work in specifically. Today we're going to be briefly summarizing all the major changes in Halo 2's story from the original cut storyboards. And for those that aren't aware, the development process for this game was absolutely brutal, requiring significant amounts of crunch and an entire third of the campaign being removed, so Bungie just could merely make the shipping date. If you want every single detail on the cut story in a beautifully animated format, I highly encourage you to check out C3 Sabretooth's series on the cut Halo 2 storyboards, which I'll link in the description, of course. And massive thanks to it. It provided a valuable resource when researching for this video. So in most versions of the original story, everything up until the end of Cairo Station would play out similarly, if not outright identically, to what we got in the final release. But the first divergence is a somewhat controversial one that was discovered by fans. So this subplot would have seen Miranda Keyes betray the Chief, make a deal with the Prophets, and strap a bomb to Chief's armor. Yeah, it's easy to see why this would have been controversial, especially when viewed in isolation. This original plotline seems absolutely absurd. However, when we take the context of Halo 2's storyline as a whole into account, it can slightly make sense. Hear me out. It's clear from the very first to the very last cutscene in the game that the parallels and differences between Chief versus the Arbiter is really what's at the core of Halo 2's narrative, right? Outside of defending Cairo Station, which was the introductory level basically, this Miranda betrayal of Chief would have happened on Chief's first mission after leaving the awards ceremony, making this a potential one-way mission very early on for him. Meanwhile, after his torture scene, which was literally paralleled with Chief in the intro cutscenes, Arbiter on his first mission is told explicitly that he is not expected to survive this mission. In other words, after all of his service in the past, the Arbiter's higher-ups are selling him out and sending him on what are perceived as certain death missions. Much akin to how in this cut subplot, Miranda would have sold out and betrayed the Chief despite all of his service to the UNSC. In fact, the parallels run even further, as in both cases the leadership is knowingly selling out who is widely recognized as the best individual warriors in their individual militaries. Thus, they're both seemingly willing to weaken themselves merely just to betray one of the most accomplished warriors of each faction. And by the way, this would have taken place during the famous cut level Covenant ship, which would have seen Chief boarding the Covenant ship as he destroys it in the cutscene after Cairo Station, and you would have destroyed it far more manually than in a cutscene. Although I must admit, that cutscene's pretty cool, so that's a pretty fair way to repay us for getting that mission cut, I say. While the two Heretic missions as the Arbiter would have had similar plots, there would have been some significant environmental changes. Firstly, the Heretics were originally stationed on Basis, the largest moon orbiting the gas giant which the first Halo ring orbited. And the second change is while Burial Mounds, which is one of Halo 2's multiplayer maps, see one of the previous videos in this series talking about the multiplayer, that's in the final product and is said to be on Basis, but they depict it as arid and desert-like, when originally it would have looked far more frigid and lunar according to all art and descriptions. And several missions later in the original Arbiter storyline, the Index scene would have also played out not just somewhat differently, but outright antithetically of what we got in the final release in many ways. In this version, the Great Schism has already started by the time the Arbiter reaches the room where the Index was, and the UNSC just straight up got to the Index first and retrieved it. So Arbiter, having failed to secure the index in this scenario, but still looking to regain the Prophet's favor, chases them down in an attempt to revive it. But just as the Arbiter eventually catches up with them and starts fighting them, they're eventually surrounded by Tartarus's forces, which causes everybody to pause, who are then subsequently interrupted by some megafauna cyclops thing living on the ring, which then is obviously eventually killed by the brutes and collapses. But that's not the end of the chain reaction though, as then the Cyclops falls through the platform that the Arbiter and Chief were standing on, breaking it and sending them down into the ring's underground. They don't end up having their Gravemind group intervention sort of thing until after both characters explore the underground and stumble independently onto the Gravemind. Foreigner's ship was supposed to be the cut level that would have gotten the Chief from where he fell to the Gravemind, but almost none of that mission was seemingly ever fleshed out, so I don't really have much to tell you about that one. Much like in the final game, the Gravemind would send Arbiter to the control room area, and Chief would go into High Charity itself. However, the Foreigner key ship section at the end of the missions on High Charity for Chief would have varied a bit, particularly aesthetically, given this version of the story was far less subtle about suggesting the Foreigners were ancient humans, and we'll get to that even more so later. The key ship originally had just a blatantly far more UNSC/human design motive. Just look at it here. And then finally getting to the cut third act, and while Chief would still return to Earth after the High Charity stuff in this scenario, he'd be returning to the Covenant, unearthing the Ark itself on Earth, rather than merely a portal to it like we got in Halo 3's story. So upon reaching it after landing, or the area at least, not the Ark yet, the Chief would fly around in a Phantom with Johnson and Miranda looking for an entrance into the Ark, only for the Arbiter to beat them to it, all on his lonesome. And then being ahead of Chief, the Arbiter would ultimately get to the Prophet of Truth first, rather than with him simultaneously like we got in Halo 3. We actually have audio for most of this exchange with Truth, actually, in this version, and in my humble opinion, this dialogue would have been even more impactful than the iconic moments we got in Halo 3's version of the Arbiter confronting Truth. Again, full thanks to C3 Sabretooth for this audio. This is taken directly from his recreation of that moment, so play that.
Can you see, Arbiter? The moment of salvation is at hand. It will not last. Now kort hvile på vent. Det setter på deres sønner redoar. For simmer hvile på vent. Your kind never believed in the promise of the sacred rings.
And which promise is that? That the great journey is for all of us? That the Prophet shall lead us in good faith? That the elites shall make the galaxy a graveyard and never ask why or wherefore?
Surfathim's erger var det for. Ammal spår det som precis är his.
You knew all along what Halo would do. How many would die?
Så där blev jag nu den naked färd.
One. Unleashed.
Following Truth's defeat, Chief deactivates the array from the Ark, causing the Ark to begin collapsing after the shutting down of the firing sequences of the rings. Ultimately, the Chief and the Arbiter split up, with the Arbiter pursuing Guilty Spark further into the underground as everything is collapsing around them, and he eventually does catch up with Spark in some sort of chamber with a coffin in the middle, with a bunch of data streaming and all sorts of stuff, and when peeling back the top of the coffin, the Arbiter is stunned to see nothing less than a full-on human skeleton, which Guilty Spark affirms is a Forerunner. Even I, as someone who prefers the Forerunners and humans being separate species, on a narrative level, broadly speaking, must concede that this would have made the entirety of the original Covenant War storyline even more fantastic on a narrative level than what we got from the original trilogy, which, quite frankly, I thought was impossible.
Oracle! This is a Forerunner. Oh, that is impossible. It cannot be.
Today we're finally getting to the art direction of Halo 2, so let's see where Halo 2 went with its art style. One overarching theme in Halo 2's art style is that the design was built with the intention to perform and look at best when it's stencil shaded. That's right, for those unaware, the original Halo 2 engine had stencil shadows. Check out Late Night Gaming's excellent video for an in-depth look into that if you want to know more about that interesting point. But long story short, everything from architecture of the doors to the helmets of the elites were all designed with this cut lighting system in mind. And while the cutting of that engine certainly had negative effects in the lighting of the final product, I'm glad they preemptively designed everything as they did. It gives Halo 2 an incredibly unique appearance that makes Halo 2 look very distinct, not just from its contemporaries at the time, but the entire Halo franchise as a whole. It's a unique mix of art, design, and inspirations that are just really cool and could really only come about organically. Let's go over how some of these decisions culminated in the multiple ranks you see on the battlefield of Halo 2's campaign. If you want my opinions and/or descriptions of the multiplayer levels or any weapons in the sandbox, I actually already have 2 videos in the series talking about each respectively, which I'll link in the description of the video. We'll start with the Covenant, as they went through the most dramatic changes as a whole as far as factions are concerned. The Hunters of Halo 2 are a far more sleek and color-muted take on their design in CE. With the fuel rod-like beam as their primary weapon instead of a proper fuel rod as well, they are a far more standout unit in any area. That, of course, also includes their unique body shape, height, and again, even their weapon. Just their presence on the battlefield is impossible not to notice. The Grunts exchange far more armor variations seen in CE for a color variation instead to distinguish the several ranks of them, which, given the development chaos of Halo 2, is far more than fair in my opinion. All Grunts got some of the most drastic increases in detail though from CE, with much more detailed armor, skin, and loads of these cool lights along the armor, which make this my favorite Grunt design in the entire series. The Jackals are even more drastically physically changed than the Grunts from their former iteration. Their skull is a lot longer and thinner, with their eyes going from this orange color to a bloodshot pink. Their teeth are a lot thinner as well, and they even get a redesign for their armor shape. Lastly of note, the infamous Jackal Sniper is actually the first time in the series we get to see a Jackal unit on the battlefield without a shield. The last returning unit of the Covenant is the Elites, which arguably still to this day are bearing their most iconic design in this game. As mentioned before, their helmet is redesigned with the intention to cast shadows over their faces, and much like the Grunts, they also get a lot more detailed skin and lights applied to their armor as well. They're also given a lot more animations that really help give their body language a unique vibe, especially when angry elites draw their energy sword in anger. The Brutes make their first appearance in the series here and are depicted as big hairy guys with minimal armor and weapon straps. Kinda like the Wookiees, you know? Much like how the Elites get highly expressive animations to show how they are in a frustrated state, the Brutes, when angry, drop their weapons and charge at you on all fours in an attempt to charge you down. Overall, it's a design that contrasts brilliantly with that of the more sleek-styled Elites. I especially love the holographic flag designs that the Captain Brutes have. Those are just super cool. The drones are very buggy in their design, for lack of a better term. And no, not the Bethesda kind of buggy. Their body is segmented and covered in their exoskeleton armor rather than the manufactured armor which the rest of the Covenant ranks use. They have 6 limbs with a pair of arms, legs, and wings, giving them more maneuverability than any other species on the battlefield, with their flight being assisted by these little gravity devices on their wings which aid in flying in thinner atmospheres. They also have these super cool bright green eyes that really stand out well in darker areas. Prophets are depicted as very lengthy, thin, and almost entirely hairless or featherless. They wear tons of ornaments and jewelry that looks almost too heavy for their fairly frail depicted stature in comparison. They are also given plenty of ornate robes, which would have worked brilliantly, in my opinion, with the cut concept of the prophets using staffs to fight rather than like a chair laser that we got in the final game. Like here in the cut storyboards, we could see what that would have looked like, and honestly, in my opinion at least, it's even more awesome than the final product. Switching over to the UNSC side, since the Flood Sentinels basically went through few if any changes from CE other than like a general increase in graphical fidelity as far as design style is concerned at least. The Marines were given far more traditional military-style gear and design compared to their counterparts in CE, which carry a slightly more sci-fi look in general. They lost the exaggerated plate shoulders and that cool green visor piece in exchange for tons of buckles, straps, and camo pants. The most notable change amongst the entire returning cast, as well as the UNSC, however, is none other than the Master Chief himself. The new Mark VI armor would ultimately become the template for his design, arguably still to this day, 2 decades later. They introduced visor lines, reshaped the visor opening itself, remodeled both the top and the sides of the helmet, in addition to all the other changes outside of the rest of the armor besides the helmet. Basically everything has been updated here. Last but certainly not least is the Arbiter. Contrasting with the armor of the rest of the elites, the Arbiter's armor doesn't stick out as much along the helmet, shoulders, and legs, fitting his build much more tightly, with the only exception being the shoulder guard. It also seems to cover much more of his body than the regular elite armor than others, which with its dark gray color and engravings as well, it really helps his armor stick out, making the Arbiter look slightly less tanky, for lack of a better term, than the other elites. I know I said that they had looked fairly sleek in design, but like the Arbiter even more so than the other elites as far as the armor is concerned at least. Hey everyone, today we're going over all the cinematography from every cutscene in the game, as well as a few extras that I thought were noteworthy. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started. Starting with the destroyed Halo ring in the first image is a brilliant reminder right off the bat to returning players of their accomplishments in Halo CE. Whilst for the new players, it immediately sets the scale of some of the tech in the Halo universe, with the planet in the background giving us sort of scale. Same with the Covenant ship, obviously in the foreground, for how big this rig really is. And I think the text saying when we are at the bottom right here is very important. Like, while we may not know how long these ages of reclamation, quote unquote, are, saying we're in the 9th implies a long history, which obviously the Covenant indeed has. The shot of the Banshees flying over the mist and the fog of High Charity continues to help give us this sense of scale, with this shot in particular helping us appreciate the true size of High Charity's interior. And then afterwards we finally focus on the core of the introduction, which is to introduce players to the Arbiter. Having him give his perspective on the events in CE, as well as being judged harshly for it, gives us what we need to understand the Arbiter as a character as far as his history and perspective is concerned heading into this game. Now we switch over to the Chief in an award ceremony, which serves the role of hinting at the story arc upcoming in Halo 2's campaign for each other. Chief being the respected hero of humanity who stays stoic, whilst the Arbiter is a disgraced villain who must go through many trials to later walk alongside Chief, spoiler alert, as a hero. It also contrasts positively towards each other, with the UNSC being very friendly towards each other and the hostility within the internal ranks of the Covenant, and contrasts those two very well. Eventually the festivities on the UNSC side are interrupted and we don't switch back to High Charity for the rest of this cutscene, as the cutscene now focuses on leading us into the first mission as Chief. Much like the end of the intro cutscene, this one serves as a vehicle to move the story along rather than give us any deeper insights into the universe or anything like that. In fact, this cutscene actually ultimately served as the replacement for a cut level in the campaign, which would have not only seen us driving in the ship that we destroy in this cutscene as the Chief, but we would have had the bomb that we use, the Space Pickle. It would have been attached to the Warthog, all the way driving through all of the ship in an entire mission. And while I am of course sad that we got less content than the devs intended, as Joe Satan said himself here,
but the reason why we have the bomb...
I know what you're thinking.
Boy, that looked fast. Well,
because the
Unfortunately for us
original
both,
plan was to have a level after this one.
Oh, yeah.
Called Covenant Ship.
Covenant Ship.
And the Master Chief, much like he did in the announcement trailer for Halo 2, there was no bomb. He would just man up, pop the airlock, bam, land on the Covenant ship, tear it apart from the inside.
Right. But instead, you did probably one of the most amazingly ridiculous cutscenes in the history of games.
Well, I figure if you're gonna cut a level, this is the way to cut it.
I won't.
By creating just as much work.
love the slight little tease here as players during the build-up to release seem most excited to see Halo's take on Earth and its setting. So first we, focus on the ship, then we get a top-down view of the Pelicans before finally the camera pans up to reveal an epic skyline peeking above the clouds with Covenant ships and its beam all the way firing down to the surface, looming over some of the city. We also get a series of shots afterwards where the characters are here explaining themselves a bit, and the scale of the city as well as the UNSC forces is also expressed very well here before eventually a brand new and now iconic vehicle of the franchise, the Scarab, stomps in and takes down our Pelican. We don't get another cutscene until the end of Metropolis, but it also starts with showing us the Scarab causing havoc across the city. However, Johnson comes in to give the group some reinforcements and the encouragement that they can take down the Scarab, which is hinting to the player that that's the ultimate goal of this mission. Johnson being Johnson, he also gives us some classic Johnson quotes to lighten the mood even further. Our time on Earth concludes with this cutscene. Right away, Chief walking away from the Scarab he destroyed very confidently, followed by the massive Covenant ship over the city fleeing and immediately making a run for it. Johnson is of course very excited as he flies in, but we immediately cut to Miranda as the cutscene instantly switches from celebratory to tense. Miranda is hurrying Chief and Johnson back into the ship, and she is going full speed in pursuit of the fleeing ship as it makes a slip space jump right above the city. As always, the soundtrack only enhances the emotions of the cinematography that it's trying to give us to guide us towards emotionally even further as the string really builds up the suspense here. We start this cutscene in the first-person view of the Arbiter to sort of symbolize the transition from Chief's side of the story, ultimately pulling back towards a third-person view for the rest of the cutscene, as is typical with most Halo 2 cutscenes. This bit panning past the elite honor guards is setting up for later. Spoilers, but this won't be the only time that we get this angle of the honor guards as Arbiter is moving through here, and the composition of the guard is going to drastically change. And then here, even the brutes who are portrayed in this game is very new to the Covenant and all its traditions. They all kneel in unison and respect the orders of the prophets, even though they clearly don't like their decision. Clearly, Tartarus in particular is working extra hard to gain the maximum amount of favor that he can from the prophets. Given how rigid the Covenant caste system is, it's easy to see why the brutes dislike the elites above them, to say the least. And given the prophets wield just such a disproportionate amount of power, it's easy to understand why Tartarus will ultimately go down the path he does. This slow scrolling across the countless Arbiter's tombs alongside the prophets lecturing about the history of the Covenant really helps give players the weight of that history in a fantastic way. In just a few short minutes, we've seen so much information about the Covenant in these Arbiter cutscenes, and this weight of history in every aspect really enriches all of it, especially the reveal of the Arbiter's set of armor. And then this camera turn here is super handy because it tells us where we are in the galaxy specifically. We're in this area of space along the ring in CE that was destroyed by the Chief. In fact, High Charity itself is right above the gas giant the original ring orbited. Here, Artas giving his rally speech to the group sort of sets some parallels between him and Johnson. Both are super powerful, wise, and sarcastic heroes who are incredibly close to each protagonist in the game that we play as. It also gives us even more differentiation between the species than we can say in gameplay personality-wise, with the grunts goofing around here while the elites are obviously very orderly and serious. And just like how we started the cutscene in the Arbiter's point of view, we zoom back into it as this cutscene ends, smoothly transitioning into the mission as far as gameplay is concerned itself. Arbiter displays his determination at several points here, first by banging on the shield door he knows won't break his smack, and then by immediately turning to the projection of the station and stating that his intention is to cut the cable despite the obvious danger that poses to himself. Now this sequence of events is very interesting. Us players already know at this point in the story that the Covenant and the Great Journey are lies, but the Arbiter does not. So seeing the heretic leader so eloquently tell the truth to the Arbiter gives us some hope he may start to see the Prophet's lies. But sadly, he attacks the Arbiter while he is speaking to 343 Guilty Spark and genuinely trying to hear him out. It's a tragic moment because not only does that result in the heretic's leader's inevitable death, but Arbiter sinks back into eating up the Prophet's narrative again. Oh, and Tartarus also, just like Electrograb, forces Guilty Spark with a hammer here, but he's been through worse, you'll be fine. We then flip back over to Chief's side as Miranda's ship is making it through the other side of the portal using the Covenant carrier as its sort of target to make it through. The camera turns to give us this beautiful shot of the Halo ring in orbit around the massive blue gas giant with the crew flying towards it slowly. And then the cutscene continues, alternating between showing us who's talking aboard the ship and then giving us these beauty shots, so to speak, of the ring as they close in on it, up until they finally send the drop pods down at the surface of this new Halo ring. Anyone familiar with Halo 3 ODST can see, when watching this cutscene at least, where the inspiration for its fantastic intro comes from. Quite frankly, the drop pods are just an awesome meeting between a cool concept and epic design, in my opinion, in general. And then we get all sorts of varying camera angles of the pods as they break into the atmosphere and eventually land onto the surface. We can see it from the side, below, above, and even in third person from the perspective of some of the Covenant troops on the ground as this swarm of drop pods falls towards their position. Finally, this series of scene ends with the player getting back into action as the Chief obviously busting open the drop pod door and wielding the rocket launcher. At the end of Delta Halo, we get this brief cinematic where Cortana helps alert the Chief to the Prophet's plans as this hologram of him is literally singing it out loud. It switches back to Miranda with a holographic model of something that returning players are going to recognize by its shape, and it's nothing other than the index itself, which is needed to activate each Halo ring. And this scene ends with switching back and forth between the two groups as they formulate a plan to split the party, with Chief pursuing one of the Prophets, while Miranda and the rest of the crew go to the library to steal the index from the Covenant. The ominous advice in D&D of never split the party rings into mine. Spoilers for later. Near the end of the next mission, we get a brief cutscene here of the Chief walking onto the platform where the Prophet hides as a Covenant fleet teleports in above him before immediately switching back into gameplay for the rest of the level, letting you take him out. And then when the mission ends, Chief comes back outside and suddenly, some of the ships are way close, and a lot too close for comfort, in fact. As you can see side by side comparing the two, booking it as hard as he can, he just is a few feet from the giant laser beam being fired down as he leaps into the water, where from the depths below, the grave mine slowly rises to drag the Chief further down into the water. We come back to the Arbiter's perspective in the Sanctum of the Hierarchs, where he ultimately reports on a successful mission and is going to be tasked with retrieving the sacred icon that the UNSC crew was just talking about earlier. We see the former elite honor guards walking away helmetless with their heads held down in shame while the brutes are walking in. We see the brutes actively confiscating their gear in front of the Arbiter, as well as two brutes fighting each other over a single helmet. With no word said, we can already tell that there was quite literally a radical changing of the guard, and both the audience as well as the Arbiter himself as a character can see this overthrow with our own eyes in action. Here the Arbiter takes a long look at the elites, debating with the hierarchs in the inner chamber, that are at least the ones that were given an audience, giving us a clue that he, without verbally communicating it, has had his first seed of doubt planted in the Prophets. There will be several more as we move along in this story. As the conversation moves along between showing off what they think they've learned from Guilty Spark, aka the Oracle, and having nothing other than a literal Halo ring installation in the backdrop of this entire conversation, it's clear from the Prophet's perspective, or at least, how they are trying to appeal to the Arbiter here, by providing things that they believe he would consider evidence, so to speak, to keep them in line, or at least any follower of their faith. You know, this whole notion of, yeah, you might not like the decisions we've made against you and your people, but hey, look, they were necessary because now we're all closer to salvation now, you know, all that sort of BS. Some of that we see in the real world, unfortunately. And then here's a brief interaction with the Arbiter and his crew, which is just Tartarus and his brutes this time instead of the elites that the Arbiter has consistently showed more camaraderie with. And with the end of this cutscene giving us a preview of some of the new Sentinel units that you're going to be fighting in this mission as it chases off Tartarus and his Phantom. As Quarantine Zone wraps up, we get a good shot of elites gather to hear another motivating speech by Arcos, with the camera focusing on him for the majority of the brief cutscene and only focusing on the Arbiter at the end as we transition into gameplay. While I don't have anything interesting to point out visually when it comes to this cutscene of the Arbiter getting on the gondola to pursue the sacred icon as Artas stays behind, audio-wise, I do find it extra heartwarming and poetic that the music playing here when the Arbiter has to leave Artas behind is somewhat similar to the music playing much later in the campaign when, spoiler alert, Chief has to leave Cortana.
Structure in the center of the city. It's a Forerunner ship. And Truth is heading straight for it. If he leads the Covenant fleet to Earth, they won't stand a chance. You have to stop him.
That brute has the Index. And Miranda and Johnson.
At the conclusion of this mission, we get a long and very important cutscene where ultimately the foreshadowed betrayal of the Arbiter, just like the rest of the elites, is enacted. This starts with a lot of tension-building music and scenes even before Tartarus arrives. Miranda nearly falls and is only saved last second. Johnson hears dead silence and calling for his men that he brought with. And then, of course, the Arbiter uses his invisibility cloak to sort of sneak attack the two human characters. And then ultimately, even the Arbiter himself ends up getting surprised as out of nowhere, just when the Arbiter is wrapping up the conflict, Tartarus uses his hammer to grab Miranda from him. Then proceeding to give what is effectively his villain speech, announcing his intent to destroy the elites and be the quote-unquote vanguard of the Great Journey, as he calls it. And his words are nothing but pure ominous against the Arbiter.
A bloody fate awaits you and the rest of your incompetent race. And I, Tartarus, chieftain of the brutes, will send you to it. When the prophets learn of this, they will take your head when they learn. Fool. They ordered me to do it.
Symbolizing our return to Chiefside, we first start this scene from his POV as he is being wrangled by the Gravemind, then giving us several angles of the Gravemind's head and just how massive it is compared to the Chief, before showing us the Arbiter also being dragged down from above, who's now also in the Gravemind's grasp. Appropriately, the sound design for this cutscene has no music whatsoever for almost all of it, with the characters talking and some light atmos being the only things we hear. And then when the Gravemind reveals the Monitor and the Prophet that he has under his grasp, it is evident to see they must have been under his control for a while now. The Monitor is constantly in the red, agitated state, you know, visually, if you remember from the fight against Guilty Spark in Halo 3.
To destroy this installation. Unacceptable! Unacceptable! Absolutely unacceptable! Protocol dictates action! I see now that helping you was wrong!
Meanwhile, the Prophet is so infected by the Flood that it's hard to tell where his body begins and the Gravemind form ends. After giving the two main characters in this campaign a lecture on the mechanics of Halo rings, he throws, he being the Gravemind in this case, each character into a portal, where we then get this wonderful view of the Halo ring, High Charity, and the Blue Gas Giant all together in the sky, with beams and explosions from the ships, and then the Brute Honor Guards beating down grunts in a rebellion inside High Charity, where we're able to see the violent overthrow, and rebellion has expanded well beyond the demotion of the elites and betrayal of Arbiter at this point. And then in none other than the very chamber where the prophets are giving their victory speech after getting the icon, Chief is just teleported in suddenly. I love this little moment, which just somehow justifies that after everything you went through with the Gravemind, that Chief could somehow possibly start this mission with a weapon at all. Like, this is just a great justification for that. We end Gravemind with Tartarus and his guards slowly walking away their most important hostages onto Phantoms to attempt to activate the ring from the control room. This includes Miranda, Johnson, and Guilty Spark. Miranda takes a glance at the crashed in Amber Clad before we see a ceremony where Tartarus is receiving the sort of instruction by the prophets, which is obviously interrupted by the Flood. And then in the exchange, the Brutes win, but ultimately Truth orders them to just purposely leave Mercy behind, despite that fact that they'd won the fight, so that he can be killed by the Flood. which is clearly demonstrating that this is nothing more than a power grab for truth. Back on the Arbiter's end, his teleport in from the Gravemind goes much more smoothly, with him transported on top of this beautiful cliff before starting the mission's gameplay. The outro cinematic for this mission is also relatively brief, with the Arbiter being confronted by what at first is an unknown wraith, only to have Artas emerge as the one driving it. They start catching up about everything that is happening as the Phantoms, Tartarus, and his brutes are flying in and start flying right overhead. We can see it is none other than Tartarus himself that gets out into the control room with all the captives in hand, shutting the door behind him. Take note of the door shutting, by the way.
Okay, now watch this. I bet you very few people are going to understand this sound effect that's supposed to happen here. What? Hear the door slam shut? Remember that door slamming shut.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Because at this point, we had decided to cut some levels at the end.
Yes.
And you flipped around some half levels.
Right.
And there were some continuity questions.
We cut back in time to Chief coming down a gravity lift in High Charity right as the Phantoms of Tartarus were flying away. Even the Prophet of Mercy is there just where Truth left him. He gives just a few last words before dying when Cortana comes out of the nearby panel. And the shots here of High Charity behind Chief as he talks to Cortana just look so fantastic. Even when it turns to focus on In Amber Clad, just the background in this part looks so scenic. To emphasize the need to hurry, the cutscene then wraps up with a flood-flown pelican just crashing only a few hundred feet away at most, maybe in front of Chief and Cortana, with loads of flood forms flowing out of the end of it there. And then the mission ends with Chief going through this epic green light tube thing through the key ship and only making it in the last second by scraping in before the door closes behind him. And then here we see what Cortana is seeing as the key ship flies away, leaving her behind in the flood-infected High Charity. And then, of course, we cut to the ship itself as it leaves through the portal. Back on the Arbiter's end, right after Tartarus shuts the doors to the control room.
Okay, now, meanwhile, let's hear the sound effect.
Okay.
There! That door closing sound.
What is that place?
Was that same door closing sound. See, no time has passed.
That really brings it all together.
See, now we understand that no time has actually passed.
That's
We're
right.
just picking up where we were. Jason even didn't know that.
That was your solo attempt to try to fix the way
that
we
was Joe said, no, just put the door closing sound in again and people will realize that no time has passed. I'm like, I don't think anybody's going to get that, Joe. Sorry.
That was your idea, Joe?
Well, wait a minute. How come you're blaming that on me?
Ultimately, he decides to heed the Gravemind's warning and gets Artas to help him break into the now locked control room. Halfway through the mission, the Arbiter will get an even bigger firepower backup in the form of Johnson here with a frickin' Scarab rather than simply a Wraith earlier. Johnson put it here better than I ever could.
You don't like me, and I sure as hell don't like you.
But if we don't do something, Mr. Mohawk's gonna activate this ring. And we're all gonna die.
Tartarus has locked himself inside the control room.
Well, I just happen to have a... Come on, grab a Banshee and give me some cover.
He's gonna know we're coming.
Now, with more than enough firepower and getting inside, we confront Tartarus, where we get my favorite scene in the series. Not only is the dialogue fantastic, but the angles they use to contrast each side and convey each character's emotions as this group of around half a dozen major characters navigate this negotiation attempt by the Arbiter are just perfect as well. Even Johnson gets the cheesy zoom-in and one-liner that adds some comedy to this scene where effectively the Arbiter's basically trying to negotiate the peace of the galaxy with Tartarus.
Not another word.
Please. Don't shake the light bulb. If you want to keep your brain inside your head, I tell those boys to chill. Go ahead. Do your thing.
Tartarus, being far too invested in his scheme for brute dominance in the Covenant, of course, at this point, refuses all reason, and hence we get arguably the hardest legendary boss battle in the series if you don't know what you're supposed to do. If you do, it's definitely not, but if you don't know what you're doing, it can be pretty difficult. The final cutscene gives us some last-second tension as Miranda has to navigate this spinny thing without falling to her death. And even when she does that successfully, she still takes the icon out and it ends up sending a signal out of the room, which worried new players would be concerned that it may make the ring fire. Back in the key ship Chief had recently got on, and we see it on the other side of the portal, flying above none other than Earth itself. And we get to see Lord Hood for the first time in a long time as he is having a back and forth with Chief to figure out why he's on the key ship that the Prophets control, while the Covenant are attacking the space above Earth, with Chief saying the final lines of the campaign that teased at the inevitable Halo 3.
Tell me what you're doing on that ship?
Sir, finishing this fight.
Today we'll be briefly going over all the versions of Halo 2 outside of the original, which, as you can tell, the series is primarily focused on. This includes the DS version, the Vista port, and of course the most popular form of Halo 2 nowadays, the Anniversary Edition. And we'll go over each in the order that I just listed. In 2007, an article was released where someone claimed to have had a Halo 2 DS port that they played. After a lot of speculation, reasonably so, about the validity of this claim, a video was released showing the guy who made this claim originally literally playing it on camera. We're not sure which studio made this, but it never got released, and sadly, it is confirmed that the one no copy we just saw be played is lost. The dual screen feature, as you can see, is utilized in addition to it fairly clearly using some alteration of the GoldenEye DS engine, but other than that, we don't know much. Of the three released versions of Halo 2, the Vista version is arguably the black sheep of the trio. It's the only version exclusive to PC. It was the only version not developed at all by the studio overseeing Halo at the time. In the case of the original Halo 2, that was Bungie, and in the Halo 2 Anniversary's case, that was 343 Industries. It's the last version of Halo to have an editing/creation mode not called Forge. It has no co-op campaign whatsoever, and it's the only version where the cutscene quality was actually downgraded from the original version. It's not all bad though. Up until MCC released on PC, it was the only moddable version of Halo 2, and between the release of MCC and the shutdown of original Xbox Live, it was the only version of Halo 2 with online multiplayer whatsoever. And while a lot of work has gone into making the Anniversary Edition closer to the original, arguably Halo 2 Vista's biggest legacy will be that it was the version of that Halo 2 Anniversary was originally founded on, which still sort of runs in MCC's DNA, so to speak. Released exactly 2 days after Halo 2's 10th anniversary, Halo the Master Chief Collection gave Halo 2 a far more proper anniversary treatment than Combat Evolved Anniversary. For the first few years, the only thing that worked consistently was campaign, but once this game got the well overdue updates it deserved, we got arguably the best game in the franchise, assuming obviously you consider MCC its own separate game. I mean, on one disc, players got all of Halo CE, both in traditional and anniversary graphics, Halo 2, also both in traditional and anniversary graphics, Halo 3, Halo 4, ODST, and Reach, all with both full campaign and multiplayer features. Forge, Firefight, Theater, you name it, it's all there. And speaking of the anniversary graphics, my goodness, Halo 2 Anniversary is still, 10 years later, one of the most beautiful games of all time. Both the cutscenes as well as the in-game models have been treated with such love and detail, it's no understatement to call this a masterclass performance by all the parties involved. Halo 2 Anniversary has not only set the standard for all future potential remasters within the Halo franchise, but speaking for myself personally, I see it as having raised the bar for all remasters across all franchises. And over time, that has only become more and more true thanks to its long run of being heavily supported by the studio behind it, with many of the small blemishes left from being a port of the Vista version being corrected and making it more akin to the original, as mentioned before. But lastly, one of the most intangible but arguably most important aspects of Halo 2 is its legacy. And to give some insight on that, I asked a couple members of the community 2 questions. Question 1. What has Halo 2 come to mean for you personally since its release all the way back 20 years ago in 2004? And then the second question, what do you think the legacy of Halo 2 will look like 20 years from now? And here were some responses from some very kind creators.
Halo 2 shows what the series can do, and spreads its wings in a unique and creative way, narratively and artistically, which is very informative of the time in which it was created. The gameplay isn't my cup of tea. I think it's easily the worst of the original trilogy in that respect, but it's got more than enough to make up for that in art direction, sound design, music, and direction for the narrative. What it personally means to me specifically is a funny question, since it's easily the game I've focused on the least. I'm a CE girl, what can I say? But I'll do my best to summarize. To me, Halo 2 is a game that has an incredible amount of charm and presence that drips with late Xbox era 2004 style. It's the Halo game that could probably be placed into its time of release the easiest, being dated in the absolute best way possible. This connection it has to the mid-2000s is something that I adore, and helps it stand out among the other Halo titles. Halo 2's legacy in another 20 years will likely be growth of what it is now. It is what the community expects and demands of the IP holders of Halo. Somehow, despite its flaws, Halo 2 is often heralded as a peak for the series, and many big names in the community like Hidden Xperia claim it as one of, if not their favorite game. My personal feelings differ greatly from the public opinion, but that will not stop those who deeply enjoy the game from doing so, which I greatly respect and admire.
Halo 2 invokes many emotions from me as a player. It holds one of my biggest gaming accomplishments being monopolised, the achievement for beating the game on Legendary in under 3 hours. Though a Halo 2 runner I am not, this achievement cemented my love for speedrunning in the series and single-handedly got me to where I am now. The game feels burnt in a way, however. You can see this in the dev cycle of the game being as hellish as they can get, the amount of stuff on the cutting room floor, and the whole ending getting axed. So, funny story, when the game first came to MCC and I did my first playthrough, after the epic, "Sir, finishing this fight" line got delivered, I got so confused when I was booted back to the main menu. I thought MCC bugged out for a second, as it tends to do, and I had missed a crucial scene or mission. As crisp as the gunplay feels, and even how good the original graphics look, as mentioned prior, the game just feels burnt in several ways, and undercooked in many others. But despite all of this, I'd much rather play Halo 2's campaign over many other modern first-person shooters. The burntness of the game leads to this amazing freedom though. There's so many ways to get out of bounds in the maps, and so many ways to see behind the scenes. They also let you approach the game in ways that the devs both knew and probably didn't know about. For this reason, Delta Halo is probably one of my favourite missions in the franchise. Being able to get out of bounds immediately, skip the bridge with a frag boost, then hop back out of bounds again and so on, it's just, I don't know, it's amazing. The difficulty is another point I feel gets a bad rap. Halo 2 Legendary is brutal, don't get me wrong, but it almost feels like it wants you to meet it on its level of brokenness. Jackal snipers notwithstanding. It wants you to abuse the power of the noob combo, exploit the AI where you can, and once you master the combat, it feels amazing. There's no better feeling than dominating missions like Gravemind or Regret once you match the game's ebb and flow. I unfortunately can't comment on the multiplayer since I was never there for its heyday, but I've heard the legends of how great it was, and it paved the way for so many of the systems we take for granted in online gaming today. I hope Halo 2 stays as popular in the future as it is right now and was back in the day. I hope new people come along and conquer its brutal legendary difficulty and live through its top tier story. The mechanics hold up in an amazing way and it's a must play for any fan of first person shooters. I hope more things that were left on the cutting room floor are unearthed as well and made playable, just like the E3 demo that's coming to MCC soon. It'd be so cool to live through Bungie's original vision of the game. As a speedrunner too, I want to see the game continue to grow and evolve. While the game's world records are about 1 hour and 5 minutes, I someday hope to see the record drop below 1 hour. This would be an amazing feat for whichever runner takes up the task. I want Halo 2 to be remembered and treasured for the rest of time as it deserves to be. This game is a testament to what can happen when an ambitious developer wants to create something so badly, but is also a tale of managing expectations with reality.
Hello there, guys, gals, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Leipaladin, and Halo 2. What a game. I played it way too young at a friend's house when I was no older than 7, and it was the first console FPS that I ever remember playing, and was really what hooked me on the Halo series and also gaming as a whole. To me personally, it means a lot, as I can trace back the start of my YouTube journey to Halo 2. I would never have become a content creator if it weren't for my love of Halo, and subsequently I never would have had the opportunity to connect with so many amazing people through the Halo community. Everyone from content creators to former developers who worked on Halo 2 or other titles in the series. I think my taste in music would be significantly different if it weren't for Halo 2. The soundtrack blew me away, pun intended. As a kid, it influenced my own style as a pianist and composer, and it's still an absolute banger to this day. But most importantly, if it weren't for Halo 2, I never would have made so many fond memories and friends through the multiplayer, and especially custom games in Halo. Friends who I've grown up alongside and seen go to university, start their careers, buy homes, have a family, all because I knew them from a random game of infection, or it was something I was able to bond with a classmate over who I otherwise never would have considered talking to, but I did because of Halo 2. I think Halo 2's legacy 20 years from now will still be one of significance. While a lot of people who grew up playing Halo 2 on the original Xbox will likely have moved on by then, it's my hope that the game will still be looked back upon fondly by newer generations who will have the opportunity to play it on the Master Chief Collection. The wonderful thing about the classic Halo games especially is that they have an almost timeless quality to them, especially Halo 2. It's very much a product of the time it was made in, with a rock and roll soundtrack that featured artists that were very popular in the mid-2000s. Of course, graphically, it's very original Xbox, if you know what I mean. But it has so much charm, such a compelling story with amazing characters, and was a pioneer for the modern online matchmaking experience. So much of what we take for granted in online multiplayer games was because of Max Hoberman and his innovations in Halo 2, that it stands out among the other games of its era. I think the story of how it was made, Bungie's struggle to pull this overly ambitious project together, still fixing stuff by the 12th hour, is both hugely inspiring, but a cautionary tale that helps to give people an insight into how chaotic game development can be. And that's not even mentioning how much it did for the Halo universe, introducing so many concepts and characters and species and events that would become mainstays for the franchise going forward. Quite frankly, I don't think you have Halo in 2024. Moreover, I don't think you have gaming as we know it now without Halo 2.
Whoa, it's like a postcard. Dear Sarge, kicking ass in outer space, wish you were here.
I heard that, jackass.
great journey waits for no one, brother. Not even you.
The prophets have betrayed us.